big believer that the quality of the question determines the quality of the outcome. So this is look at this presentation through soft eyes. Lots of opportunities in here to ask different questions that might deliver different information that could be really good for the company. So let's just introduce the speaker. An internationally renowned thought leader in emotional and social intelligence, decision-making, and risk management, Dr. Gleb specializes in helping forward-looking leaders concerned about resistance to change. He serves as the CEO of a boutique consulting and training company called Disaster Avoidance Experts. Its proprietary methodology transforms negative emotions and resistance around change into positive emotions and commitment by using narratives, nudges, and neuroscience. A best-selling author, Dr. Gleb is most well known for Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, and his newest book is Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. His groundbreaking thought leadership has been featured in over 550 articles and 450 interviews in prominent venues like USA Today, Time, Fast Company, CBS, Fortune, CNBC, Inc. magazine, and many more. In fact, he was quoted earlier this week in USA Today. Dr. Gleb's expertise comes from over 20 years of consulting, coaching, and training. His clients include innovative startups, nonprofits, and Fortune 500 companies ranging from Aflac to Xerox. His expertise also comes from his research background as a behavioral scientist with 15 years in academia, including 7 as a professor at Ohio State University. In his free time, he makes sure to spend abundant quality time with his wife to avoid disasters in his personal life. So the floor is yours, Dr. Gleb. And as of yesterday, when you just turn the meeting over to me when you're done, so we have the Zoom account, and I'll let you. Thank you, and the floor is yours. Enjoy, everyone.
All right, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Pete. All right, so let's talk about all the risks that you outlined, and more broadly, the kind of patterns that go on behind the risks. There are lots of ways that we as leaders make bad decisions. And I run a company called, as Pete mentioned, called Disaster Avoidance Experts. It's a professional services company, training, consulting, coaching, and risk management, change management, decision-making, strategy and planning. Those are all things I know and I understand as well. And I make my own share of mistakes, although less than some other folks because I've learned about these strategies. These are strategies that are rooted in just our brain, how our brain works, the structure of our brain, and the way that our brain is actually not adapted to the modern world. So we'll talk much more about that and what we should do to address these problems in the presentation. So the first part of the presentation before the break, we'll talk about the ways that we make mistakes, the ways that we as leaders make mistakes, and the ways that our staff make mistakes. Personnel and organizations make plenty of mistakes as well. We need to address those. So that's the first part of the presentation. So you'll be more aware of these mistakes and the kind of questions that you should ask to address these mistakes. So that's going to be the first part of the presentation. And we'll have an activity where we discuss what's going on in your organizations and report that out. So you'll have an opportunity to interact around that. So that's the first part. And the second part will go into addressing these problems. What are the strategies? What are the techniques you can use to address these dangerous judgment errors that cause us to really make bad decisions and take poor risks or fail to take advantage of opportunities? There's a couple of folks here see their biggest risks as not taking advantage of opportunities. So that's the structure of the presentation. That's what you can expect. Now, let's talk about a little bit getting into specific details, specific evidence about where business disasters come from. And business disasters, that's anything that has a significant negative impact on your bottom line. My company is called Disaster Avoidance Experts because we focus on helping companies avoid negative impacts to their bottom line through managing risks, making good decisions, and so on. So that's what you want to avoid, significant negative impacts to your bottom line. And what we know, what we've found from extensive studies, not simply ours, of course, but extensive studies across a wide variety of fields, especially in behavioral economics, or kind of how companies behave, is that the large majority of business disasters come from poor decisions. Poor decisions at all levels in the organization, but especially at the top levels, because those are the most influential decisions that can result in disasters. So there was a study of the 423 US companies with huge companies. These aren't small companies. These aren't mid-sized companies. These are huge companies, 500+ million assets. So large companies, that's big size, and that went bankrupt from 81 to 2007. So this is before the 2007, 2008, 2009 fiscal crisis. So that's before that period when a number of healthy companies were swept away during a more normal period. There were 423 companies with 500+ million assets that went bankrupt. These are all the companies during that period. And the study looked at the causes for them going bankrupt. Why did they fail? It found that of all the bankruptcies, just under half, 46%, are purely attributed to bad strategic decision-making by the leadership. Just bad strategic decision-making, leaders making bad decisions. That's what there came from. Of the 54% of the rest, many of the rest likely could have been avoided if the leadership didn't make bad decisions, but it wasn't purely due to that. But 46% were purely due to bad strategic decision-making by the leadership. I'll give you an example. If you remember the company called Polaroid, shake it like a Polaroid picture, right? I remember when I was a kid, my parents took pictures of me using a Polaroid camera, getting those instant photos and shaking them. So, maybe that ages me, but that's kind of just some part of my memory. Well, Polaroid was one of these companies that was looking at what's going on in the marketplace in the early 1990s. And it saw the growing trend in digital cameras. They were becoming more and more popular. And of course, Polaroid has a great brand for digital. Instead of shake it like a Polaroid picture, you can have snap it like a Polaroid picture, right? So that's a great brand for digital. Well, it did a study of the kind of evaluation of what should it do. Should it go into digital or should it stick with its photographic film business, the physical film? And it found that going into digital would result in about half the profit margins that it was getting from its physical film. The digital profit margins would be about 30%, whereas its existing physical film profit margins were 62%. Great profit margins. I wish all of us had all of those profit margins, right? So that's wonderful profit margins. They decided that no, we don't want to go into digital camera. We'll stick with our physical film. Thank you very much. Well, what they discovered was that 62% of zero is still zero, and they went bankrupt in 2001 because of the growing digital trend, which was clearly growing, no reason for it to stop growing. So that's Polaroid. Now look at the similar situation in Fujifilms. Exactly the same business model, making physical film, making a lot of money out of physical film. And in the early 1990s, Fujifilm was making the same decision. They were evaluating, they just did a study. They found that their physical film has about twice as much profit margin as if they went into digital cameras. But they understood that digital cameras, okay, they're clearly growing. There's no reason that this trend line will stop. It will clearly keep growing. And so they decided to squeeze their physical film for all the profit they can and invest it into digital as much as possible. And they succeeded. Right now, they're doing quite well. They are a $6 billion company. So that's an example of a bad strategic decision-making by the top leadership and good strategic decision-making by the top leadership. That's where the top leadership strategic decision-making can lead to or away from. So that's the kind of decision-making that you want to be thinking about, and the number of risks, whether you're going into the new area for the intelligence contractor, is that area going to be beneficial? Is that area not going to be beneficial? Doesn't mean it's the same thing as a digital camera that you should go into it, but that's the kind of risks that we're talking about. And there are a number of other risk areas, kind of strategic initiatives that I've been hearing from folks that are similar in terms of where you want to be heading with your company, with your orientation. How do you want to be addressing these risks, these trend lines that you're seeing right now? Now, one of the really important things in addressing risks is to avoid being blinded by negative information. Unfortunately, denying negative facts about the company, about the future, is too common for top leaders. Not saying that you do it, but it's very common for it to happen. And perhaps for you, perhaps for other employees in your company, for the other leaders in your company, it's very common for us to deny negative reality. There was a study of 1,087 board members, of 1,087 members of boards of directors who fired their CEOs, their top leaders. And when you look at the causes for them being fired, their CEOs, 23%, over a fifth of them, were fired for denying reality, for ignoring negative facts about company performance. That's what they were fired for. So of course, the Polaroid leadership ignored negative facts about the future trends of the digital cameras. Look at what happened with Boeing. The top leadership of Boeing ignored negative facts about the 737 MAX. There were internal emails about the 737 MAX, which stated quite clearly, and that was later released internal emails as part of a congressional investigation, that this is the 737 MAX was called by a top tester that this is a plane designed by monkeys supervised by clowns. This is not something, I'm quoting here, this is not something that you want to hear about your new model of airplane. And that's, the leadership ignored that. They thought, well, everything's fine. All our previous planes were safer than the last ones we released, so new models are safer. This new model will be just as safe, at least, if not safer than the last models. They followed the trend lines. They thought that, okay, we'll just follow the trends, we'll be fine. But look at what happened. They had 2 huge crashes with 346 people dead. And even before the pandemic, wiped $25 billion off of the market value of Boeing. And of course, top leadership like Dennis Muilenburg were fired. And that was a big, big problem for Boeing. And it's only right now starting to get back on its feet with the approval of the 737 MAX after about 20 months offline, and huge hit to their reputation, which is potentially even going to be worse in the long run. So that's the kind of things that where leaders tend to deny reality, negative facts about the future. Now, denying negative facts about the future, bad decisions, overwhelmingly come from our emotions, from how we feel. We don't really talk about and think nearly enough about how emotions drive our feelings. When we go with what we feel, what we're comfortable with, when we go with our gut, that is going with our emotions. When we have certain feelings, certain intuitions, we feel something is right, and we go with it. We believe something is right, we're comfortable with it, and we believe it's true, and then we go with it. And that's a very frequent tendency for leaders, including leaders who deny reality and who get fired, including leaders who lead their company into bankruptcy, that 46% of all bankruptcies. That is very common because we don't recognize when emotions, problematic emotions, are driving our decisions. Frustration, anger, anxiety, fear, hope, optimism, joy, those are emotions. They're not inherently bad. But when we don't realize they're driving us to make bad decisions, that's when they can be very damaging. Because when we just go forward with our natural state, our intuitive state, how we feel, studies show that about 80% to 90% of our decision-making comes just from our emotions. That's very challenging for us to realize. It's not comfortable, but it's true. That's what our intuitions are, what we feel. That's emotions. That's our gut reaction. So it comes naturally, when we do what comes naturally to us, rather than using evidence-based decision-making strategies. And we'll talk more in the second half about these evidence-based decision-making strategies. The first half of the presentation will be about identifying these problematic mental errors, these dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases that drive us to make bad decisions. Now, before going onward and talking about the specific cognitive biases, I'm going to take a poll. So if you look at Zoom, you'll see a polling option right now that's going to be popping up. And I would like you to please vote in the poll. So that poll will be about yourself. Was there ever a time when you were very confident that you were right about something and you turned out to be wrong, and it caused you to doubt other areas where you might be right or wrong? I know it happened to me. I hired an assistant manager once for my company who I thought was going to be really good. I promoted her from the ranks. She was doing quite well in the ranks. But when she got into the assistant manager role, she became increasingly ambitious and micromanaging, problematic in a whole variety of ways. I had to eventually let her go. That was not a great fit and a great situation for the company. So that was pretty bad. I want to know if that, and that certainly made me doubt my judgment about hiring people and promoting people. So did that ever happen to you? Something like that. I see 7 out of 9 people voted. So please, 2 more people. Whoever didn't vote yet, please go ahead and vote. Oh, perfect. Everyone voted. Great. So we see that this is something that happened to you as well. If you understand that, that's most likely something that came from an emotional place where you felt you were right. You were very confident. Confidence, of course, is an emotion, it's consideration, and then you turned out to be badly wrong. All right. So let's go on to talk about these specific ways that we go wrong. Before we talk about that, I want to answer a question that many of you might have been wondering. Not when you first saw me. When you first saw me, that's not something that is confusing. You heard my name, it's kind of weird, but then you saw me, like, mainstream, normal, white American male, right? Well, when you first heard me speaking, that probably shifted your perspective a little bit, because obviously I have an accent. As folks say, I'm not from around here, right? So where are you from? That's a question I get asked very often. Where are you from? I'll be happy to answer that. I'm from a small country in Eastern Europe called Moldova. That's home for me. My parents left with me when I was a kid, when I was 10, and settled in New York City. So that's where I grew up. That's really home. Moldova, I kind of barely remember that because I was 10 when I left. So I grew up in New York City, then traveled around the United States. I lived in Boston, got a master's there at Harvard, then got my PhD at UNC Chapel Hill, and finally got a job as a professor at Ohio State University, where then I started doing consulting, coaching, and training, which led to my current career. But anyway, so I left in 1991 and Moldova. Now, I was pretty pleased when I came to the United States, but I was especially glad when I saw a World Values Survey that was conducted in 1996, which showed that Moldova is the least happy country in the world. Least happy country in the world. I mean, I have no idea why it's the least happy country in the world, but it's just the case, just the fact that it's the least happy country in the world, and that according to the World Values Survey, and that made me especially glad that my parents left. So I mentioned I settled down in New York City. And when I lived in New York City, it's a cultural metropolis melting hub, kind of like Washington, D.C. You see people with all sorts of accents. So it's very diverse. And while many people chose to drop their accents, especially those who immigrate to the United States, especially those who came to not New York City, not a melting hub, many people don't come to New York City and other areas, they come to the middle of the country, and they drop their accents. Well, I chose not to drop my accent. My parents taught me to be proud of my cultural heritage, so I decided to keep my accent. Unfortunately, as I started to travel outside of New York City, in Boston, that was still fine, but especially UNC Chapel Hill in Columbus, Ohio, where I currently live, that made me realize that I made a dumb decision, unfortunately, in keeping my accent, especially as I was going for my PhD training in behavioral science, in the history of behavioral science at UNC Chapel Hill. I discovered there's a phenomenon called accent discrimination. So there's a lot of studies that show that people with accents that are perceived not to be mainstream American accents, whether it's a Southern accent, whether it's a specific regional accent in the US, whether it's any sort of foreign accent, like my Russian, Moldovan accent, they will be treated in a negative way. They will be perceived as less trustworthy than someone who is a mainstream American person. That is an unconscious perception. That is something that doesn't feel like you're realizing it, but it kind of, there's something off about this person. There's something about this person that means that they're not from around here, they're not part of my tribe, they're not part of my group. That is a feeling that is very natural and intuitive. And that happens to, again, according to studies, the large majority, not necessarily you, but large majority of Americans feel it, and you need to understand that's what happens, this accent discrimination. There's only one accent to which this doesn't apply, and there's the British accent. They still have that cultural imperialism going for them. So that's the false perception of being less trustworthy. And the reason that's important to understand is that's part of a broader, two broad cognitive biases, these dangerous judgment errors that come from how our brain is wired. The halo effect and the horns effect. The halo effect and the horns effect. Now, the horns effect refers to people having little horns. When someone has a characteristic that you don't identify with and therefore dislike, if it's something different than yours, if it's something that signals that someone is from a different group, from a different tribe, whether it's an accent, whether it's their appearance, whether it's their ethnicity, whether it's their religion, whether it's their political views, whether it's their ideological views. So if you dislike that one characteristic, you'll tend to dislike all of their other characteristics, tend to have too negative a view, not trust them, see them as not trustworthy, despite them being very trustworthy or just as trustworthy as someone who comes from your own cultural background, appearance, accent, and so on. And the halo effect is kind of the opposite. Someone has a little halo on their head, and when you like one characteristic, so if you're from the South, and if you live in DC, you meet somebody else who's from the South, and you share that accent, you will tend to like them more than they deserve to be liked, trust them more than they deserve to be trusted. Same thing is if you went to the same college, if you root for the same team, if you kind of bond around similar things that you feel like as they're part of your tribe, that's something important to you, you'll have too positive a view of their other characteristics. And that's really bad for all sorts of business relationships. I'll give you an example. I was giving a presentation here in Columbus, Ohio, to a group of HR leaders in diversity inclusion. It was a closing keynote 2018 for the regional HR conference in diversity inclusion. And if you know anything about Columbus, Ohio, you'll know it's the home state of the Ohio State University Buckeyes, so OSU Buckeyes, so go Bucks. And we have a big, huge football rivalry with the University of Michigan Wolverines. Unfortunately, the Wolverines team got sick with COVID, and they recently canceled the huge game that's played at the end of the year between the OSU and the University of Michigan. So that won't happen this year. We won't have an opportunity to defeat them again, unfortunately. We've been beating them every year since 2011, so that's great. Now, unfortunately for not going to go into there for the kind of COVID reasoning, but in this presentation, and we can talk about that later, in this presentation, what happened was that in Central Ohio, you have the overwhelming majority of folks are Buckeye fans like me. So I asked those leaders in the presentation, the diversity inclusion leaders, HR leaders, whether they would hire a University of Michigan fan. There are over 100 people in the room. And I asked them again, would you hire a University of Michigan fan? And you know what? Only 3 of them raised their hands. 3 of them raised their hands. I have that on video, which is great. I'm glad it was videotaped. So 3 of them raised their hands, and that's pretty typical. Obviously being a fan of the Wolverines doesn't have anything to do with your ability to perform well on the job or not. That's a typical horns effect. But just because you feel like they're not part of your team, you feel negative toward them because of that one characteristic, that is going to sink their chances of being hired by you. That is a big problem. Or going to work for you, for folks have a talent acquisition challenge. That is a big problem. That's a big challenge for the business relationships that we form. The same thing happens. So you have that horns effect going on. That's very powerful: hiring, promotion, business relationship development, and of course, halo effect. When somebody went to Ohio State University and roots for the Buckeyes, they'll be much more likely to hire them than they deserve to be hired. Again, the same thing happens for all sorts of other characteristics as well. And that's something you have to understand. So that's one dynamic that goes on in terms of hiring, promotion, business relationships, but it also goes on within teamwork. So when you think about teams within a company, right? You have 100 people in the company, you have some operations, you have several hundred people, you have the department, let's say operations and sales. I see a lot of tensions going on between operations and sales pretty frequently. Partially because there is a sense of teamwork within operations as a department. So the department pulls together, they have a sense, yes, we are operations, we work on the production, right? The product development or something like that, depending on what your operations does. And there's a sense of teamwork in sales, where we're in sales, we sell, and we are the real people who make this company run, and operations feels that they're the real people who make this company run. And then there's a sense of competition between those teams and fighting and conflicts between operations and sales. And that's a big problem. You have that sense of teamwork within and sense of competition without. That causes a lot of problems for companies. I mean, operations and sales, marketing and sales, I see that happening so often. Did we give you good leads or not? Didn't we not give you good leads? So fighting over that instead of working together to improve the lead generation and the acquisition process. That's not great, and all the aspects of the funnel. So you have the horns effect going on and the halo effect within companies as well, and damaging internal team collaboration within companies. So we talk about the benefits of teamwork. We don't talk nearly enough about the dangerous aspects of teamwork. And you need to understand the dangerous aspects of teamwork. It's going to be just as important as the beneficial aspects of teamwork can sometimes be more damaging if you don't address these halo and horns effects. All right. Now, what I want you to do right now is think about where these areas might be impacting your company and write them down. We'll be doing a discussion activity before the break where we'll have everyone report out what are the areas of impact for their company by the horns effect, by the halo effect, and a couple of other cognitive biases, and discuss that as part of a group. So please write that out in anticipation of this discussion. So please take 30 seconds to write that out. Go ahead. And by the way, if anyone has any questions as we're going through the presentation, you're welcome to, or comments, you're welcome to type that in the chat, and I will be keeping an eye on it and answer them as we go along. And of course, there will be a separate Q&A section that will be much more thorough. Ben said that there's no M's in Columbus on science. Yes, yes, we call Michigan Ishigan. It's the University of Michigan. All right, so you can finish writing later, of course, but right now what I'd like you to do is take a look at the poll. So it'll be polling, again, throughout the presentation, the same poll that you did before, same style, but the question is, in your workplace, how problematic is the halo effect and the horns effect? It's not a problem, it's a moderate problem, or it's a serious problem. So which is it? Not a problem, moderate problem, or a serious problem? Whether that relates to building business relationships, hiring, promotion, internal teamwork, and conflicts around that, please vote. All right, I see 8 out of 9 people voted. So last person. All right. Okay, and we clearly see a pretty balanced response. So it's not a problem for about a fifth of you. So great, I'm glad that that's not a problem for you. But for the large majority of you, 4/5 of you, it is a problem. So it's a moderate problem for over 50% of you, and for over half of you, it's a moderate problem, and for over a fifth, it's a serious problem. So I'm glad that you're realizing it, and that's something really important to understand. We'll talk about how to address these problems later, but for those for whom it's a serious problem, that's something to really consider as a short-term priority to how do you figure out strategically how to address this problem and bringing it to your leadership. For those who see it as a moderate problem, you want to kind of more in the medium term within the next month or so, think about what are ways we can address and bring it to the people's attention, specific areas where it can be addressed. All right. Let's go on to a little bit more broad. So we talked about a specific example of this cognitive bias. What's the broader framework behind what's going on? How does our mind work? How does our gut reaction function? What's up with going with your gut? Why is that a bad idea? I mean, you have a lot of gurus who tell you to go with your gut. Tony Robbins, who tells you to be primal, be savage, do what comes naturally. You have Malcolm Gladwell, who tells you to make your decisions in the blink of a moment in his book, Blink, and so many others who tell you to go with your gut, trust your heart, follow your intuitions, whatever your flavor of description is. Unfortunately, what feels comfortable to us, according to recent neuroscience behavioral economics research, is often very bad in business settings. It feels comfortable, it feels intuitive, it feels right. Just like the halo effect and the horns effect feel right. That's, for the 4/5 of you who have problems with that in your organization, moderate or serious problems, that all feels right. People are not maliciously harming others. They're not maliciously having a horns effect or a halo effect toward others. It's a natural, intuitive gut feeling just because of how our brain is wired, and it often leads to disastrous decisions that significantly harm our bottom line because our gut is evolved for the ancient savannah, not the modern world. So this is fundamentally important for us to understand. The way that we feel, our emotions, our intuitions, they're not evolved for the modern world. Just our natural primal state, what Tony Robbins tells us to be, is great for the savannah environment, but it's not great for the modern world, for where we are right now. And tribalism is a fundamental aspect of that. In the savannah environment, we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people. We were hunters, foragers, and gatherers, and we totally depended on the tribe to survive. If we weren't sufficiently tribal, sufficiently loyal to the tribe, we'd be kicked out of our tribe. And guess what? We'd die. So you notice we're the descendants of those who didn't die. And so that's kind of the halo effect, where we want to be really oriented toward people who share our values, who share thought patterns, our appearance, our accent, whatever other characteristics call on us, feel tribal, connected. Whether it's a tribe because we're rooting for the same football team and you have a strong share of emotions where, yes, go Bucks, or, whatever, boo Wolverines. And so the boo Wolverines part is the horns effect, because we in the savanna environment, our ancestors, needed to be hostile toward people who didn't look like them, who didn't think like them, who didn't share their values, their appearance, their accents, because if they weren't sufficiently hostile, this foreign tribe would come in and kill them and take their land. They're competing over land, and that's the resources that they had. So if you weren't sufficiently tribal in terms of the horns effect, opposed to hostile tribes, other tribes, you would die as well. And then you wouldn't procreate and pass on your genes. We're the descendants of those who didn't die. So that's the tribal aspect of things. That's where the horns effect and the halo effect come from. And the horns effect and the halo effect are two types of these dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases. Cognitive biases is the formal name for these dangerous judgment errors. You can take a look at them on the list of cognitive biases in Wikipedia. You'll see over 100 of them. You'll see, as part of the presentation, you got the assessment before. You'll get books if you want them. So there will be 2 books that Pete mentioned earlier that go through all of these cognitive biases that are the most dangerous ones in business settings. The list on Wikipedia has over 100 cognitive biases. Not all of them are relevant for business settings. The book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Makes the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, is the most important one for addressing these cognitive biases. It talks about the 30 most dangerous ones in business settings, the ones that are in the same assessment on dangerous judgment errors, and how to address them effectively. Then the book on the coronavirus pandemic, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the COVID-19, for the new abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, talks about the specific ones relevant to the pandemic and how to use effective strategic planning to prepare and pivot for the reality of the remaining months of the pandemic, and then, fortunately, the post-pandemic recovery, which is great news. So cognitive biases come from a combination of our evolutionary background, one of which I mentioned, this tribal sense, and how our brains are wired. And that's about the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the cerebellum. I'm not going to go into it in the presentation right now. I'll be happy, if you have questions in the Q&A, I'll be happy to go into it. The book talks more about that, so you can read that section if you're interested in it, or you can skip it if that's not of interest to you. Just go into the more business pragmatic sections. That's just going to be in chapter 1, a section of chapter 1 on the neuroscience, behavioral economics kind of aspects of things. So, our evolutionary background, we talked about tribalism. That's one really important one to realize. That's where the halo and horns effect comes from. And so you want to understand the tribalism has a lot of other consequences besides the halo and horns effect, which I won't go into in much depth here today, but the book goes into. So it's kind of a broader pattern that results in specific dangerous judgment errors like the halo effect and the horns effect. There's another broad pattern that you really need to realize and be aware of. So you want to be aware of tribalism. You also want to be aware of the fight or flight response. The main way we respond to threats intuitively with our gut reactions is the fight or flight response. The fight or flight response was great. It was life-saving for hunter-gatherers. It's wonderful in that environment because the risks they faced were immediate, intense, in the moment. Saber-toothed tigers. You might have heard of this as the saber-toothed tiger response, where you want to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. That's a great response in the savanna environment. And in the modern environment, it helps us in life or death situations. It's great in those situations. So for example, if you have a bus barreling at you, the proverbial bus, you don't want to wait and decide, well, maybe it's going to miss me by a foot. You don't want to wait for that time. You want to throw yourself out of the way of that bus barreling at you. Or if you see something flying by your head, you don't want to be thinking about, is it really going to hit me or not? It's maybe not. Maybe it's a bird. Maybe it'll veer out of the way. No, it's much safer to just duck. So that's much safer activity. In those life or death situations, that fight or flight response is great, but it's not great in today's business world, because in today's business world, that's not the kind of threats we face, but we're very tempted to respond with a fight or flight response with that sort of threat. The risks we face are much more long-term, uncertain, ambiguous. They might come from a notification on our smartphone about an email regarding this new direction that our clients in the intelligence agency are going into, and how someone is saying, well, we should do this. We should start a new division in response to it. And we might have a very strong reaction in the fight or flight response, like, no, we should not do that. That's a bad idea. And we might be tempted to shoot off a quick email saying, no, we shouldn't do this. This is a bad idea. And the email would prompt a series of increasingly escalating conflicts and exchanges that are going to be not really great for your relationship to your partners. I'm not saying that that's what happened, but I've seen that happen way too often. Or let's say your strategy toward hiring. You can be kind of feeling, well, it's a long-term risk, it's an uncertain risk, maybe and not be doing what you need to do about it because there's nothing in the moment immediately threatening about it. And there's a lot of things like this about whether it's risks like, let's say, the risk of driving, and how do you deal with that, given that it's a small daily risk, not a small, but it's kind of a daily risk rather than an immediate risk that you're facing in the moment. So our response to these long-term, uncertain, ambiguous threats are bad. We don't respond to them well. We make bad decisions about them, and we don't address them in a strategic manner, which is one of the reasons why when you were introducing yourself, talking about the risks, I was bringing up kind of the strategic aspect of approaching risks. We don't approach risks in a strategic manner nearly enough especially when they're daily risks, like issues of competition, issues of hiring, issues of the risks of people driving, all of those sorts of risks that are long-term, ambiguous, uncertain. We don't respond well to them, generally speaking. Our gut reaction is not to respond well to them. Now, you might have learned over time to respond better to these things through your experience. And I'll talk about an example when we go through the cognitive biases about how you have, through your experience, you might have learned how to respond better to certain risks, to certain problems, to certain decisions. But that's not your gut reaction. That's your learned behavior. That's your experience telling you, okay, we've probably heard that in order to really reach mastery in a certain area, you need about 10,000 hours. Now, that doesn't mean that you need 10,000 hours to really trust your experience in a certain area, but you really need a lot of time in order to trust your experience and immediate quick feedback on how effective you are in a certain area. So let's give a basic example of driving, right? When you look at surveys on driving, you see that there was a survey done on college students, and they were rating themselves as, are you a below average driver? Are you an average driver? Or are you an above average driver? Well, college students, again, rated themselves as above average drivers. 93% of them rated themselves as above average drivers. And think about the kind of experience that college students have. Now, there is a reason that insurance gives them a high insurance rate, because they tend to get into accidents much more often than other folks. They don't have nearly enough experience in the area of driving to be confident about their driving. And they overrate their confidence all the time. So this is an area where, if to the extent that you drive, you might have gained experience over time, you might be more confident. But if you really look at the risks, let's say for the pest control agency, you know that your pest control agents are driving around all the time, and many of them might feel way too confident about the quality of their driving. They might put themselves in that 93% category or even higher, who feel they're great drivers, and not be safe enough, not be defensive enough, not take enough precautions in order to make sure they drive well. And that's just one example. There are a number of areas where you have gained sufficient experience. For example, looking at a profit and loss statement. That's something that you probably have done pretty often in the company, and you can tell in the blink of an eye, or probably be a blink of an eye, whether an area of the company is doing well or not when you're looking at the profit and loss statement. But it took you a lot of time to do that. You had to learn, looking at profit and loss statements over time, what's going on well, what's going on and not. It took you at first a long time to go through it, and really you made many more mistakes than you do right now in going through it. So that's a learned skill, it's a learned behavior. And we don't learn it, we don't have at all nearly enough experience learning it with these long-term, uncertain, ambiguous risks, because they tend to be not something that we get feedback on. They're long-term, they're uncertain, they're ambiguous. So we don't know whether we are making the right decision or not. And we tend to trust ourselves way too much, and trust our guts when we're facing such risks. All right, let's talk about another specific cognitive bias that relates to the fight or flight response. So we talked about the the Halo and Hordes effect, that's about the tribalism. Let's talk about the fight or flight response. And this is the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias, if you've heard about any cognitive biases, you've probably heard about the confirmation bias. It's very prominent, very popular. It basically describes our instinct to see the world through rose-colored glasses. By that, I mean glasses that are interpret the world in such a way that it seems to align with what we currently believe, with what we feel. It leads us to look for information that confirms our current beliefs. So when we look for information in our company, like Boeing did for information, Boeing's leadership looked for information that said that the 737 MAX is fine, it's great, it's wonderful. And they rejected information that challenges their beliefs, like information that the 737 MAX has serious issues, designed by monkeys, supervised by clowns. Not great. So that is some information ignored. Same thing with the leadership in Polaroid. Looked for information that confirms their beliefs that the physical film is much more profitable, and ignored the information about the trend in digital. I'll give an example from a Vistage member. So this is a Vistage member who, we're going to do an exercise in a little bit before the break, and where we'll be discussing this stuff. You'll be discussing what you're writing out. And this was the kind of exercise I did a couple of years ago, where a Vistage member shared a story about how they joined Vistage that really revealed a lot of important information that their members didn't know before, only to share you before, because this was a pretty personal story. So this is a story that happened about 5 years before the member joined Vistage. And what happened was that this is a member who was really a long-time business owner. He founded a company, a small manufacturing company, in 1970. And right now the company has about 110 people last time I talked to him. And it had a little bit less than that at the time that this occurred, maybe like 105. And so he was running this company, again, started in 1970. In 1979, he brought on his first salesman. And the salesman eventually became his right-hand man, very trusted, not simply in sales, but as part of the community. He was eating with this person. He was part of the same church. They were serving in the same kind of community service activities. So they were pretty trusted, pretty close together. And at one point, what happened was that the sales in this company started to drop. And again, this was about they were working together for about 40 years by this point. So the CEO called his VP of sales, this right-handed man, trusted man, and said, hey, what's going on with the sales? And the VP of sales said, hey, we're just doing some change management in the department, some transitions, instituting new processes. We'll have temporary drop in sales, but it'll pick back up quickly, be much better than before. So the CEO was like, fine, sure, I trust you. Yep, great, go ahead. Well, what happened 9 months after that was that the VP of sales, and the sales kept not being great, but CEO trusted that. And this VP of sales, 9 months after that conversation, quit and went to work for a competitor, taking a number of existing client accounts and prospects with him. And by the way, this is a B2B company. So they made heavy manufacturing. So each client was a pretty big deal, big ticket items. And so this was a big, huge blow to the company. The CEO started investigating what's going on, what was the situation. And what he discovered was that the VP of sales was, for a long time, for over a year already, feeding information to that competitor, and he was eventually went to work for the competitor as the COO for the competitor. And then he was trying to figure out what happened. And I mean, this was a friend. This was, someone who he not simply worked with, but he regularly ate with, hung out with, part of the same church. It caused them a lot of tensions in the church. Not going to go into that. So that was something that was a big issue. And he found out that, well, what happened was that the VP of sales was really pissed, really felt betrayed by something that happened when the CEO hired a new COO. And the VP of sales wanted to be in the COO position because he wanted to take over the company not take over the company, but kind of be in that leadership role as the company was transitioned from the CEO to the CEO's son. So this was a family-owned company, and the CEO wanted to transition to his son eventually. But the CEO decided that he needed to hire, not simply go for the internal talent, but he needed to bring in new blood, and he needed to bring in someone who can serve his son for a long time going forward. I mean, the VP of sales would have retired not too long after the CEO, maybe 5 more years or so, based on their age, 5 or so years. So he wanted to hire a COO who would be with his son for a long time, for 10, 20 years at least, ideally more. So he brought in somebody from outside the company with a lot of experience, trusted and so on, and wanted to train him for a long time, get him into the company before transitioning. Well, the VP of sales was very pissed, very upset, felt betrayed. And so that's what he started to do, started passing on the information, and eventually quit, went to work as the COO for the competitor. And the CEO, once he realized what happened, he began to look back at signs, and he saw that he was missing signs right and left, that the VP of sales, not simply was it that there was decreasing sales, decreasing issues, but there was more secrecy, more tensions, more hostility within the company, which the CEO kept missing. He was rejecting information that challenged his beliefs about the VP of sales being trustworthy, and he was looking for information that confirmed his beliefs about the VP of sales being trustworthy. And he learned, he spent a lot of time, he learned that he was not really great at falling into this confirmation bias, and that other people in the company fall into it all the time too. So he spent time fixing the company. It took him a while to recover from the situation, and he eventually began to look for, how do you actually address this confirmation bias? And he realized he needed an external perspective. He couldn't just trust himself as he did previously. And so that's why he ended up joining Vistage. And that's how he came to share his story. So now that you know that, I want you to take about 30 seconds to write where the confirmation bias might be impacting your company. And again, this is to be discussed and reported out as part of the discussion. Don't have to share something as intimate and personal as that CEO did for the company, but something that would be helpful and impactful for other folks who are going to be discussing this in the group with you. So please go ahead, take 30 seconds to write that down. And again, if you have any questions that come along as we're talking, always pop them in the chat, that's fine. And we'll have a broader Q&A after, where we can go into more depth. Yes?
How much before we have our first break, do you think?
About 20 more minutes.
20 more minutes.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we'll do the same poll as we did before. How problematic is the confirmation bias in your workplace? So how problematic is it? Is it not a problem? Is it a moderate problem or a serious problem? Of course, for that CEO, it was a very serious problem. What's going on for you? Is it a moderate problem, a serious problem, not a problem? See, 7 out of 9 people voted. Great, let's get those 2 other people voting. All right. Okay. Oh, so we see an interesting distribution. So this is definitely more of a problem for overall than the previous one. So it's not a problem for one of you, for 1 out of 10, it's for the rest of you, large majority, 90%, 89%, it's a moderate problem or a serious problem. So it's good to realize that, and it's good to realize where you and your employees might not be looking for the right information. David, we'll see you soon. So look forward to you coming back. So he has to hop off for a bit. All right, great. And then let's go on to the last one that I want to share before we have a discussion on this topic. The optimism bias and the pessimism bias. Optimism bias and the pessimism bias. Optimism bias and pessimism bias, again, have to do with the fight or flight response, and they have to do with the way that we interpret risks. So the fight or flight response, right? That fight is about an aggressive response, and flight is about a defensive withdrawal response. Optimists tend to be much more fight response oriented. They tend to be much more seeing the world as full of opportunity, seeing themselves as mainly prevailing in conflicts, being very entrepreneurial. They're very creative. They're great at generating ideas, but they tend to be too risk blind. And I say this as an inveterate optimist myself. I see the world as, as mostly a bright place. I see the grass is green on the other side of the hill. I see the glasses half empty, and I'm too risk blind. So I have 20 ideas before breakfast, and I think they're all brilliant. I feel they're all brilliant. I've learned in my bitter experience to recognize that they're not all brilliant, but that's how it feels. They feel all brilliant. So that's the optimism bias. The pessimism bias is the opposite. People who are more pessimistically inclined tend to be see the world from a more hostile perspective. They tend to be defensive. They tend to have the flight response, the withdrawal response, the flight or the freeze response, so freeze in place or flee. They manage threats instead of orienting toward opportunities. They tend to be stabilizing rather than entrepreneurial. They tend to improve things rather than create new ideas. They tend to be not too great at generating new ideas, but they're great at improving existing ideas. And they tend to be too risk averse. So if you've read the book Traction on integration, you will notice that the visionary persona, people at the very top of a company, tend to be more optimistic. They tend to have that more opportunity-oriented vision, whereas the people, that's kind of the CEO position, whereas people in the COO/integrator position tend to be more pessimistic, holding their feet to the ground. So you need both people. You need all sorts of people on a team. You need on your leadership team, on your decision-making team, you need at least two of each persona on the team. You don't want only one devil's advocate. You don't want only one optimist. You want at least two on each team. Because the research shows that if you only have one, that person will tend to be shut down. That person will tend to not be willing to share their perspective because it's just so opposite to all the others. So you need at least two people on the team. And you know what, for my company, if I only hired optimists, it's very tempting to hire optimists. And we were talking about this in the Tuesday presentation, where there was one person who said that his company tends to only hire optimists like himself, and they tend to look in their thought process, seem too similar to themselves. And this is a big problem. Optimists tend to hire other optimists, and pessimists tend to hire other pessimists because we feel comfortable. I feel comfortable with the other optimists. We click well, we communicate well. I have 20 ideas before breakfast, they have 20 ideas before breakfast, and we reinforce each other's ideas. That's great. It feels good. It feels connecting. It's comfortable to my gut reactions. Now, unfortunately, that's not very good business, because if I have, all pessimists on my team, I'll have 100 ideas before breakfast. Everyone will reinforce each other's ideas. We'll end up running in 100 different directions. And then we won't have enough time and energy to do any project well, and things will spin out of place, won't serve clients well, there'll be a lot of problems. Not great. So what I do instead is I make sure to hire some pessimists. I have at least two in my leadership team. So then what I do is I pass off my 20 brilliant ideas before breakfast to them. And they say, well, these are all half-baked potatoes, but maybe, these 3 out of these 20 are worth finishing baking. And they edit those ideas, and they're great at improving ideas. They're taking those half-baked potatoes and finishing baking them and implementing them. That's their great strength: implementer, improver, integrator. So pessimists, that's their strength. Optimists, that's their strength. You don't want pessimists to be involved in the initial stage of a brainstorming meeting. By the way, typical brainstorming is done poorly. When you look at the research, it does not work nearly as well as brainstorming that's much more structured, where you have people first, optimists and moderate people. There are some people who are optimists, there are some people who are moderate, there are some people who are pessimistic. So people who are more in the middle and optimists, they should come up with ideas, generate ideas before the meeting itself. Don't have them generate as a meeting. That's a waste of time for people. So you have them generate ideas before the meeting, and then come to the meeting and share their ideas, and then you can spark off each other's ideas to have new ideas. That works. You don't want pessimists at that meeting. That's just torture for them, because they feel the inherent risk of each idea, negativity toward ideas. You don't want them as part of the initial brainstorming meeting. But then you want to pass the ideas over to the pessimists and have pessimists evaluate the ideas without having that ownership from the optimists with the optimists holding on to their ideas. So the pessimists then evaluate the ideas, and then they can improve the ideas, see which ones are worth keeping, and then improving those and helping implement. That's their strength. And we talking about Vistage meetings. So yesterday we were talking about someone who was sharing an example of optimism and pessimism. And she herself is very optimistic. She has a strong optimistic orientation, but she has learned over time that she needs to look for problems She needs to look for problems in projects, and she needs to look for problems in meetings because her team tends to be very optimistic. So she learned as a leader that if she doesn't look for these problems, then she will get herself and her team into trouble. And that's an example of a learned behavior where you can trust your experience that, hey, I have learned that if I don't look for problems, it's going to lead to trouble. That's where you overcome your gut intuitions, your feelings. You're overcoming them. You're overcoming your inherent optimism to look for problems. And that's a great strategy. That's kind of the way that leaders need to be. They need to have that understanding, that emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence refers to being aware of your emotions and being able to manage them. So emotional intelligence, one of my areas of expertise, has to do with understanding that I'm an optimist, but I need to be able to manage that optimism in order to make good decisions, to look for problems, as opposed to just being excited, enthusiastic, and generating lots of ideas. As a leader, you need to be able to do that, whatever your position, to overcome your intuitions when they aren't serving you well, which is pretty often the case, and be able to make better decisions going forward. So with that case study, keep in mind that and write down where optimism and pessimism might be a problem in your organization. So where optimism and pessimism might be a problem in your organization, so take 30 seconds to write that down, please.
Jim Shannon has an interesting thought in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so right, Jim asks about Maslow and whether lower levels tie to gut intuition and the top ties to better emotional intelligence. So levels of optimism doesn't have to do with better emotional intelligence. You can be optimistic or pessimistic, and that does not have to do with levels of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence has to do with being able to overcome your initial intuitions. Whether you're optimistic, whether you're pessimistic, you need to be able to overcome that in order to make good decisions, because your optimism is going to steer you in the wrong direction, and your pessimism is also going to steer you in some cases in the wrong direction. So that's what it has to do with. Yes, so Maslow's level, when you're at the closer to the top level of fulfillment, then you are more emotionally intelligent and you are more able to recognize that, hey, my emotions are not necessarily indicative at all of what the reality is. What I feel is not necessarily what's true. Unfortunately, many people are not at that level where they feel something and they believe it's true just because they feel it. They feel anxious, therefore they think the world is threatening. They feel joyful, therefore they think everything is hunky-dory. Not the reality, and I hope you've learned that over time. So yes, so you're getting to the higher levels, you're definitely going to, as part of fulfillment, that's part of the Maslow's concepts of mastery. So having mastery over your environment involves, first of all, having mastery over yourself.
The way I would describe it, Jim, is at the lower levels, our emotions have us. At the higher levels, we have our emotions. Mm-hmm. So the journey of emotional intelligence is, what's your relationships to your emotions? Do they have you, or do you have them?
That's an important insight, Pete. And by having them, that means you can channel them into the right direction to motivate yourself, motivate others, rather than just going with your intuition, whether it's optimistic or pessimistic.
I mean, you're aware of your anger or your fear or your anxiety, but it's not driving your decisions.
Exactly. All right, let's take a look at the poll. Same poll as before. How problematic is the optimism bias and pessimism bias in your workplace? Is it not a problem? Is it a moderate problem? Is it a serious problem? So please go ahead and vote. Moderate, serious, not. Okay, so 2/3 of the people voted. We have 2 more people waiting, so 3/4 now. And 1 more person. Give you 3 more seconds to vote. All right. Great, so we see about the same breakdown as before. So Ben, Ben asked in the poll results, questioning your judgments about answering these as a whole. This is, of course, from your perspective, in your opinion. you are a leader in the workplace, right? So you have a certain view on the workplace. It's about your perspective. It doesn't mean that this is absolutely objectively correct, but you need to be able to answer this and see, okay, this is your take on things, and you can then just have other folks answer this from their take on things and discuss it. This is nothing of this is absolutely the right, truthful information, because you need to have a lot of studies and analysis to see what's going on. It's your take on things, and then you can explore and get more information to figure out what's actually going on. So we see about the same breakdowns as for the previous one. For the confirmation bias, for one person, it's not a problem, but for the large majority of you, it's either a moderate problem or a serious problem. All right. So now what I'd like you to do, so we're getting into the activity where we'll have about 8 minutes of discussion, where you will share what you wrote down on each of these. So we'll break up into groups, so 2 groups, break up into groups, breakout groups. So you'll have an opportunity you'll join a breakout room. So you'll have a way to click on the screen, says join a breakout room, where you'll discuss what you shared, what you wrote down for each of them, and which of them is the most problematic, how are they impacting your workplace. So, and if you have any feedback for others as they're sharing ideas for addressing these problems, that would be helpful for them. Please share that, of course. So okay, going into breakout groups now. Go ahead. So you should be able to see the button to click join. David, I think you said you have to jump off for a bit, so I assume that that's the case, that you're not having technical difficulties.
A tendency with the team, we're going through like diversity training right now, and I just noticed with the team that all the people I'm interviewing tend to look, sound, and they're just all very similar. Like we have like 10 people from Elon University in North Carolina, which is not a very diverse group of people. And every now and then when we get someone referred through who has a radically different background, older, different ethnicities, again, I couldn't give it to you objectively, but I tend to feel like they get a harsher critique. And we're working to reduce and eliminate that. That's on the horn side, and the halo side, it's obvious. I just explained it.
Okay. Cool. Well, this reminds me, for horns, it's actually one of the horns is definitely the France versus US. Half my business is in France, half my business is in the US, and the French think the Americans are assholes, and the Americans think the French are arrogant and pricks. So it's that's basically dealing with that on a daily basis. getting them in the room together and they saying this is the way we want to go. It's an interesting. It's almost like there's a natural. No, that's not what we want to do because it's your idea. But if it's our idea, then it's obviously better. And that's an issue for sure.
How do you pronounce your name correctly, by the way?
It's Jarlath.
Jarlath. Have you considered the same kind of cultural diversity training that so Ben is talking about his diversity training? There is cultural sensitivity training. Is that something you've done?
Not specifically, no. I mean, at the leadership team level, we've certainly brought the teams together. We've tried, you're trying to do it through, team building events and just more discussion, more natural interactions with each other. But we haven't tackled it from a very much the horns and halo scenarios you're describing, or the confirmation biases you're describing, which is all of these things you're describing are certainly inherent in this US versus France versus US dynamic that all companies have when they have, I think, particularly when half the businesses in one part of the world and half the businesses in the other, tends to be that we're better than you syndrome.
Yes. And that's one of the things that is that daily risk, that folks in kind of long-term ambiguous, it's a daily threat, and we're not realizing kind of that that's something that can be addressed and tackled in a strategic way through various forms of inclusion, sensitivity, cultural diversity training. So that's something just to think about, and I'm pointing it out there. That's clearly a daily hassle. If you add up all the stresses and tensions over a year that happen because of this dynamic, you'll see that it's costing you a lot, and not only in terms of money, but stress, retention, morale issues. So it's something to think about seriously and to address strategically.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have a similar problem. I mean, it's interesting. The example you gave about, the sales versus the operations people, we have it a little bit different. We've got the court reporters that go out and actually do the work and are client facing, and then we have the back office staff that processes it and gets it to the client. And there's always friction between who's the true importance to the company, right? The back office staff feels like, well, if we weren't here, the clients wouldn't get what they ordered, and the court reporters feel like, well, if we weren't here, the clients wouldn't get the on-site service. And we've never been really able to resolve that conflict in a meaningful way where they feel more collaborative than they do at odds. And I think that's only been exacerbated in the COVID environment, because now there's just when we were in the office, they could at least have interaction. We could have whole company events to try to facilitate that. Now it's in the virtual environment. It's been nearly, we tried to have a whole office happy hour last week, and we got like 25% turnout. And it was mostly the office staff, interestingly, that actually showed up. So that's something that causes us daily tension for sure, but we still haven't figured out how to actually resolve it.
Jay and Jarlath, I don't remember where I read this, and I certainly haven't mastered it for us, but I remember any time that you have the doctors and the nurses fighting, or the sales and the operations, I think maybe it was like Patrick Lencioni or someone was like, invent an external enemy that's like trying to kill all of you and try to use that to pull everyone together. But like I said, I've never really, or like in the ER, they always use the ER as the situation of like life and death. The urgency of it sort of forces everyone, together, as opposed to in a less chaotic, kind of a comfortable environment. So I know that doesn't, that doesn't help. But Jay, when you were talking about like who's more important, I don't know if we see that too sometimes, like developers versus designers, writers versus analysts, sales, operations. And I think Mike, our new president, has done a really good job of bringing everyone together as a team, but he hasn't done it, sort of by creating that monster that's out to get us all. I haven't really unpacked it yet, but anyway.
Thank you. Yeah, the monster that's out to get you all is not necessarily very effective, as we see in this COVID environment. Obviously, it's a monster that's out to get us all, but it has not necessarily brought people together. For Jay, for you, for Jarlath, there's kind of some mythology about that narrative being effective. When you look at what is actually effective is creating individual incentive systems and reward structures. So for example, when you have ways that individual, let's say court reporters, can provide praise and evaluation and incentives and bonuses for people in the back office who do an especially good job, kind of highlight them. They're highlighted and they get, a reward, I don't know, a few $100s reward or something like that for the one who best serves the court reporters. And the same thing for the court reporters who work best with back office staff. You want to create rewards and incentives that connect people across these divisions and allow them to praise each other in a collaborative way. That works for all sorts of things. So when you're talking about developers and designers, you want to create a way of incentivizing and praising people across teams. Of course, that's something that actually works and has been shown to be effective. Something to think about. Amy, I want to make sure that you share before we go to the broader team.
Yeah, I'll make sure, I assume I'm unmuted. Okay, so I think that, because we are a women-owned and women-run company, that a lot of our applicants have this kind of halo effect that somehow we're magical because we're women. So, I mean, which is why we have 80% of our staff are women, just because if you look at our application numbers, they're just high. So, I mean, I don't know if that's bad or good, but I think it's we're noticing an actual data to support that that's kind of occurring.
Do you find that there's any trends in thought similarity that might be problematic? So what I've seen in terms of companies that are heavily women oriented is that there's less willingness to be competitive. There's less willingness to there's a little bit more pessimism in those companies. The men tend to be more aggressive and more optimistic, which can be its own problem when you have companies that are men heavy. And I'm curious if you're experiencing problems because of that. If you're not, then you're not, but that's something that I've noticed.
It's interesting because though we are women, well, there is the pessimism, but I attribute that more to the fact that we have lots of analytical scientists.
Analytical scientists aren't necessarily pessimistic. You have a lot of analytical scientists who are certainly optimistic. So pessimism is associated with gender somewhat. So the kind of that defensiveness response, and it's natural in the savannah environment. You wanted women to be more defensive and kind of back away from fights, and in the savannah environment for men to be more aggressive. So there is an association between aggression, optimism, defensiveness, pessimism. So I'm just letting you know that.
I don't know if pessimism is the right word. I think they like to tear apart issues down to the little nitty gritty and kind of analyze them to no end.
Yep. Oh, that's definitely pessimism.
Which can come off as pessimistic.
It's not coming off. That's the pessimistic tendency. You're looking for risks. You're looking for threats. And pessimism, I don't want this to be pejorative. There's a lot of benefit in looking to risks. You want some people on your team, but you also want some people who are optimistically oriented. So you might think about specifically looking to hire people who are more optimistic, whether that's women or men, and people who will be idea generating and creative. And there's definitely people who are analytical scientists who are more in that space.
Amy, when you said that about the scientists, what I thought of that, I think it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where like if you know a lot about something, then you're appreciative of like how complicated it is. Whereas like I have a whole bunch of people that know a thimble about stuff, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I got this all figured out," and it's like,
"Yep."
No, I don't have that problem.
That's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Okay, so 60 more seconds for you to finish up the discussion, and then we'll go back to the main room. But yes, so take 60 seconds to finish this discussion, Dunning-Kruger and other topics.
Okay. I have to look that up.
Yes, so Dunning-Kruger effect.
I have a chart I can put in the chat. It's kind of funny.
Yep, and it's also going to be in the book. So the book that you'll get after the presentation, it's going to be in the book. That's one of the cognitive biases.
The others just haven't joined us yet. And we might be having some bandwidth issues, Jim. You're frozen. You back? There you are.
Yeah, folks will join us, and they're having a good animated discussion. Join us in a few seconds.
So while they're doing that, we were talking a little bit about how to coach pessimists, and Ken had a good concept on that. Can you touch on that when we get back to a bigger group?
I think looks like folks are back. So Ken, please go ahead. Like to hear that.
Oh, me? Oh,
yes.
Well, I was talking to the group and saying like we have one individual, they called him the king of no. Group, which is not really a good thing. That's, it's almost like he's the joke a little bit. And so I have to do a lot of talking with him prior to going to meetings and saying like, hey, it's about how you present things. So I got him away from saying no. It's more of a yes, but. So coach of the company, we don't necessarily say no anymore. We say yes, but, because we have to, my thing is always like, know your why. So come with the information about why you're feeling this way, as opposed to just shutting everything down, saying no.
Great, excellent. Yeah, that's an important insight for how to redirect pessimists toward a good direction. So the way they tend to act is kind of the Mr. No, Mrs. No. That's tends to be their default position. And that's their intuitive, that's what feels good to them, because they're responding to feeling of threat, feeling of anxiety, feeling of risk. So what is a more effective way to coach them is to say, hey, here is a threat that I see. In the position of scout, kind of having that scout mentality instead of the stop mentality, have that, scout, look forward to mentality. What are you seeing that everyone else is not seeing? That you're contributing to the team instead of stopping the team. So that's one way. The other is to problem solve. So say, hey, here's a way I see, here's a problem I see, how can we improve it together? How can we address it together? So not simply scouting, but improving, fixing. That's their talents. That's the core strengths they bring to the team, noticing problems and helping fix them. So those are where you want to coach them. So Ken, consider orienting the king of no toward not simply scouting, but also problem solving and fixing, improving, because they see the inherent flaws of each idea. And that applies to everyone, of course, when you're coaching pessimists. All right. Somebody else wants to share. So this is some insights from that group. Anyone else wants to share insights that they gained from the discussion?
Well, Amy just put something in the chat called the Dunning-Kruger Effect. Amy, how is it that you did that? What was going on for you to include?
So we were talking about kind of the fact that my company attracts a lot of women, and we were talking about gender relationship to pessimism versus optimism, and then we got down to the I have lots of smart science and educated people on my staff, and we talked about Ben was sharing that he has people who think they know it all, but they're at the beginning of maybe the chart. And that my people will say, no, trust me, it's complicated, and they're at the other end of the chart. So
they're pessimistic because they're really bright, like they understand how much stuff's going on.
Right.
They're
not pessimistic.
It's not necessarily pessimistic. They're less confident about their knowledge.
Yeah.
So the Dunning-Kruger effect has to do with confidence. If you know a little bit, you tend to be more overconfident than if you know a lot. But you can be optimistic and low confidence, and pessimistic and low confidence. So be careful. It doesn't necessarily mean pessimism. When you know a little, you can be very pessimistic. When you know a lot, you can be less confident about your pessimism. You can say, this is a complex issue. I'm a little bit skeptical, but we need to learn more about this rather than no way, Jose kind of. So just keep that in mind. All right. So are there any questions about the first part of the presentation? I'm going to go into the Q&A now. Any questions about the first part of the presentation that haven't been answered as we've gone along?
I have questions, but I don't want to delay. I know some might want to go to break. Are we going to go questions and break?
Yeah, let's take a break and then we'll come back and get to your questions.
Happy to. Okay. Yep, that sounds great. So let's do a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 9:50.
Hey, Peter, I might have to jump off for a call at 10 o'clock. I've been summoned into some firefighting thing I got to go deal with.
Excuse me.
Just out of curiosity, do any of you guys own Tesla stock? No? Peter, you're muted.
Did it just go through the roof?
No, it's a roller coaster. It really sends you on emotional. It'll be way up and way down. I just think it's kind of comical. I bought it at like the low point in the pandemic, and so I'm doing well, but every time I take a look, it's like up and down, up and down, up and down, make your heart flutter. I don't know how those Wall Street guys do it.
All right, we're back. Ben, you had a question.
More than one question. Happy to answer them.
I guess I have sort of a comment that maybe I would like you to weigh in on,
Sure.
which is I think, you know, my observation is that our team tends to, we tend to be analytical and sort of hunt for and make sure that we're addressing cognitive bias with issues that are sort of obvious, complicated, you know, where like all of the knowns are known, and you know, it's a problem that can be quantified and analyzed, and risk can be assessed and that kind of thing. I think where we tend to be more sort of gut oriented is in the complex and chaotic, where candidly we're just not even sure how you would assess the risk. So an example that came to mind recently was a partner agreement. We use a lot of different software. Most of the providers of the software will include a clause that says they will not directly solicit our clients or our employees, and we agree that we're not going to directly solicit theirs. And this one particular vendor wouldn't do that. And the person in charge of the contract said, look, they're in a software business. Why would they ever be taking our employees or our clients? And you know, I think that risk is extremely low. And my response to that was, none of us are in a position to assess whether this big, it happened to be a British company, this big British company would want to solicit our employees or our clients directly, or whether they own a company like ours in a portfolio. I mean, we would have no idea.
Yeah.
So we're not going to go that, but it was very contentious.
Yeah. So you just set up the second half of the presentation, Ben.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
good. No, I'll talk about this through, but there are definitely questions you can ask about this. But let's go a little bit deeper into the example so I have a little bit more context. Is there a reason they wouldn't agree to include that clause?
I would say that the best way to summarize it is their legal team said that's not something that we ever put in any of our agreements, just as a blanket statement.
Okay, their blanket statement. So that sounds...
Blame the lawyers.
I understand. So that sounds like that would be a very inflexible collaborator. Would that be a collaborator you would want to work with anyway, given their inflexibility?
I would vote no.
Okay, so you want to look at other characteristics. So if people are not including that, there can be malicious intent, obviously, to have the opportunity to take your clients, get your folks. There can be an inflexibility element where they're not willing to be flexible, collaborate with you effectively. And both of those might be exclusionary factors, or factors where they have to significantly lower their price on the software for for the contract for you to work with them, so to offset the risks. So you don't need to actually analyze in depth the tendencies of each risk, but you can see, okay, what would be risk offsets? What is the indication? What's the dynamic going on there? What does it indicate about the collaborator? How can we offset the risk? What can we do? So does that help a little bit with kind of, that sort of approach? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think more than anything, I guess the overarching thing that I've been wrestling with is I agree and recognize the way that your emotion and the cognitive bias, the old brain, can fool you. And that when you say I'm using my gut, I'm using my intuition, you're sort of operating that at an emotional level. But I guess I draw a line in the sand where I say that the place where I find the intuition, not that it's beneficial, but just not sure I understand the alternative, is where I think it comes from that Cynefin framework. I think I'm saying that right. It's not spelled Cynefin, but that's the way you say it. This framework where it divides situations into obvious, where everything can be kind of known and analyzed, complicated, complex, where there's certain things that interact in ways that we just can't quantify, the rainforest or something like that, and then chaos, which is like this, so many unknowns that, and I guess we tend to not fall apart, but there's certain problems that I'm sure there is a way to set it up for better evidence-based analysis, but we don't know. We lack the.
I understand what you're saying. So it sounds like there's a tendency to work effectively in solution with problems where you can find out the information, but you have difficulty with problems where you have difficulty finding out the information, kind of figuring out the information. And so as Pete said, we'll talk in the second half of the presentation about strategies you can use that are applicable to both. But the key is to understand that you don't need to find out all the information. There's actually cognitive bias called information bias, where we tend to look for too much information that's not really relevant to making the decision. So what you want to look for is sufficient information to make the decision and risk offsets. What can you do to offset the risk? Because there's lots of things that you can't control about the external environment, including the kind of information you have. But there are many things you can do to control your internal environment, the risks in your organization. From everything like insurance, to having a cash cushion, to having a effective business continuity plan, to understanding, okay, what does it mean if this company is not going to be flexible about this agreement that we typically have? Well, that means something about their ability to work with us as a collaborator. So kind of what's the broader tendency of the relationship going to be like? That's something that you can control. And those are things that you can definitely make good decisions on without looking for that in-depth detailed information, figuring out what are all the cognitive biases. You definitely want to know the cognitive biases and what tendencies there are about yourself. So if you tend to be optimistic, that's something that you will want to be aware of. If you tend to be pessimistic, that's something you want to be aware of and correct. Those are all internal risks.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Other folks, questions?
So Gleb, the way I just heard Ben describe this is the difference between technical challenges and adaptive challenges. And so anyway, let's just go for it. But do you know what I mean by the difference between those two?
Yes. So very complex, very ambiguous situations where you find out more information over time. And the techniques, like you said, that you already saw, they're well adapted to those sorts of situations as well as complex technical ones, because you don't need to find out that much information to make a decision. You need to figure out how much information you need to make a decision. For certain decisions, you need more information. For certain decisions, you need less information. And you certainly may not be able to find sufficient information. That's fine. Then you figure out what does the information mean and how can you offset the risks.
Yeah. So Ben, I think you're just sharing your personal experience. I think it's relevant for everybody because everybody in this call is facing an adaptive challenge. It's their version of it. So let's kind of go forward now and
I think Jarlath had a question, correct?
Sorry, Jarlath.
Not so much a question, but more of maybe again an observation. I mean, when you talk about confirmation bias, and you asked us to write down an example,
Yes.
where we may look at something through rose-tinted glasses, and just sort of dynamic going on in my organization right now. We've had some production issues, some quality issues, and when I look at the vice president of operations in my function, ultimately this individual, a major key stakeholder in the quality and the execution of what we do. But highly committed individual, 25 years experience, subject matter expert in her own right, highly driven, all those things you want to see in an individual. But at the end of the day, we've got some significant production and quality issues, which ultimately I can lay at her feet, my feet, and other members of the leadership team's feet. And here's something that I'm thinking about. Am I giving her too much benefit of the doubt? Am I giving her too much of the, okay, we'll get this fixed. It's a problem. We'll solve it. But how much of it is me just not wanting to accept the fact that maybe she's struggling in the role? And that sort of this confirmation bias. Just again, an observation more than anything else.
Yeah. How long has this production problem been going on? Just kind of fill me in on the trend line.
It's been spotty over the last sort of 9 months, 12 months period. We may execute well in one instance, and then the next instance there's a bump in the road, and then again we execute well, and there's another bump in the road, and this is part of the challenge. Trying to pin down the root cause of these issues is challenging because it's not one consistent thread. It's quite spotty, for want of a technical term. And that's one of the distractions here. It's the distraction of, well, is it an execution issue on the individual side, or is it a more systemic operational issue where we've got a mechanical issue or something like that? And trying to manage through that situation right now.
That's understandable. Has the VP of operations taken accountability for the situation?
To a degree. I mean, she ultimately knows that the buck stops with her, and she can't do it all alone. She's got a team of people that have to execute, and I'd say probably not as much as she could do, but she's not in denial, that's for sure. But I think she's also struggling with how to tackle this issue, because it's not one obvious thing. There's a number of things here that we've got to address. But I'm going back to this confirmation bias. I look at her as she has all the attributes I would look for in a senior manager in my organization, and I need to be very careful that I'm not blinded by that, because at the end of the day, if we can't manufacture to a high quality standard, we're screwed.
Yes. So I think this is something that it's definitely a huge red flag that it's been kind of 9 to 12 months, and there has not been sufficient accountability to address this. That would be a huge red flag for me. I mean, if it's been 3 months and there hasn't been sufficient accountability, that would be definitely a growing red flag for me. So if the VP of operations hasn't launched a strategic initiative to seriously address what's been going on over this time, that may mean that the role may be a little bit too much for her to handle, or him. I think you said her.
It is a female.
Okay, so for her to handle, I don't know how long she's been in the role, but someone who lives up to that role, I mean, you could certainly provide her with coaching, but there needs to be a strategic mindset, and it seems like there's an insufficiently strategic mindset, and that sometimes with a lot of experience in the industry, that doesn't give you a sufficiently strategic mindset to see, okay, there's a broader issue, not simply root causes, but strategically what's going on here. How do we address this strategically? We need to launch a quality improvement initiative that would really address this. It's much more urgent. I mean, look at the trend lines. If the things haven't changed right now, what will be different in 6 months? What will be different in a year? So looking at these trend lines, you want to be thinking about extending this trend into the future. What will happen? So that's kind of my thought on this sort of issue. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Very, very helpful. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Great. So let's talk about the next steps. How do you address these dangerous judgment errors? The first thing, of course, is to understand to not go with your intuition. We talked about that, but that is something that is incredibly important. Right now, Jarlov gave a great example of kind of confirmation bias, tendency to overlook issues, especially with someone you trust. And there's no maliciousness there, I assume, as unlike with the CEO who I mentioned and the VP of sales. But that's a very common tendency where we overlook some of the failings of people we hire. And that happened to me initially when I hired the assistant, well, when I promoted the assistant manager from her role into the assistant manager role. So our intuitions were great to help those early human beings survive. That's what they're for, but they're not great for the modern world. And you already know that from a number of areas in your life, in your personal life, for example, in your eating. Now, when you come into the break room and there's a box of dozen donuts, those delicious chocolate glazed donuts, it's very tempting to take half a donut and then, take half a donut and then maybe take the other half. You don't want to leave half a donut, right? Then you're triggered by sugar, so you take, another donut and then maybe a third, and then half the box is gone. Not that I ever did it myself, right? So that is something very common for us as human beings to be triggered by sugar, because in the savannah environment, when we came across a source of sugar like honey or something like that, we needed to eat as much of it as possible in order to survive and thrive, stuff our bellies. We're the descendants of those who were very strongly triggered by sugar. And in that savannah environment, that was great, that was perfect. That was what you needed to do to survive. In the modern environment, with the overabundance of processed foods, those donuts and so on, that causes a great deal of problems to our health, obesity and so on. So it's much better to set up learned behaviors that would address these problems, like skipping those donuts and going for that bowl of fruit that a vendor nicely sent you for the holidays. So instead of going for those donuts, the bowl of fruit, much better option, or whatever you do. So fruit is not nearly as triggering, of course. So you have probably developed habits to protect your physical health, to protect your diet, to do exercises, which aren't comfortable, which aren't intuitive. They're learned habits. Nobody's born liking salad. When babies, you see them loving sugary candies. They don't love salad. It's an acquired taste. So that's something that you need to learn how to acquire the habits, just like the participant from Wednesday's presentation learned, despite being an optimist, to orient toward problems and get more of a pessimistic perspective on what's going on in her team and the problems in her team and the projects that they're looking at. The assessment and dangerous judgment errors, that's something that Pete emailed you, and hopefully you've taken a look at it. If not, we'll go through it here anyway. And if you've taken a look at it, we'll go through it here anyway. It focuses on those 30 most dangerous judgment errors that I talked about, those cognitive biases in professional settings, which my book goes into in depth, and the assessment is part of the book, and the book talks about it much more depth. And again, you'll get the book, you'll get the assessment if you haven't taken a look at it. It evaluates the extent of these cognitive biases in your workplace and their impact. So we talked a little bit about the extent with the polling, goes in much more depth into that, and provides you, fortunately, with the next steps that you need for addressing them. It's a great tool for a needs analysis, for evaluating what's going on in the organization. What are the kind of cognitive biases that are the biggest problems for your organization? So I strongly encourage you to take it yourself, to give your perspective. And again, this is not about getting the right score, the perfect score. This is about surfacing problems. So if there's a way you can frame the question in order to get a more positive answer, to get a less positive answer, you want to give an answer that reveals more problems, because you want to correct the problems. This is not the assessment to grade yourself and whether it's a wonderful organization or not. This is to address and see what kind of problems there might be that you can address. Taking it yourself and then having your leadership team and your emerging leaders take it is a very effective way of figuring out what are the bigger challenges for your organization, getting everyone on the same team to be aware of them and be more and more committed, getting buy-in into addressing these challenges. So let's take a look at the assessment, and I will show it on my screen. So you'll be able to see it on my screen. Let's see. Great. So you should be able to see it on my screen, and then I want you to open up the chat box. Oh, welcome, Jim. So you're just in time for the assessment. You should be able to see on my screen the assessment itself. And please open up the chat box. We'll be using the chat for this function. Each of the questions here refers to a problem that might occur in your professional setting. Now, you have to understand that these problems are not saying, you know, what's the halo effect and the horns effect and all of these confirmation bias. They're talking about behaviors. So you don't need to know about the cognitive biases in order to take the assessment, which is why it's great for leaders in your team to take it. They don't need to know anything about cognitive biases to take it. Of course, it's good for them to then learn about cognitive biases after they take it and see what's going on, but they don't need to know anything about these cognitive biases in order to take the assessment and assess the problems. What you will be answering is about behaviors. Behaviors as a percentage of when they could have occurred. So you'll be looking at, over the last year, how often these behaviors occurred as a percentage of when they could have occurred. So you can do it for focusing on your organization as a whole, or in a specific department, or in the team, whatever you're doing. So that applying it to that. But for you right now, we're going to apply to the whole organization. Don't want to overthink it. Just go with your initial impression. It's most likely to be accurate. Again, you don't need to be fully objective, 100% accurate. Each question should take you 15, 20 seconds, something like that, 10 seconds. So you will be typing out the answers in percentage terms in the chat. What percentage projects missed the deadline or went over budget in your organization over the last year? So what, out of all the projects that happened, what percentage missed the deadline or went over budget? 10, 5, 30%. Let's get so four people responded. Let's get a few more people responding. So you should be able to pretty quickly estimate this. How many is your initial impression missed the deadline or went over budget? So 25%. Okay, so this cognitive bias, and you're welcome to share your answers, refers to something called the planning fallacy. When we make a plan, we tend to feel, Ken says 25%, when we make a plan, we tend to feel that everything will go according to plan. That's our feeling, that's our intuition, that's our gut reactions. We are confident about ourselves and our plans. And unfortunately, we tend to underestimate the kind of risks, problems, and issues that might be facing us. And we tend to not pivot nearly quickly enough when we should be pivoting and addressing these problems, especially when it's kind of like daily risks. Well, like we're talking about with Jarlath, the Americans versus the French, those kind of contentions, or maybe too much analysis going on in Amy's situation, too much orientation toward the risk, to going in depth into each problem. All of these sorts of things, many other things where we don't make sufficiently good plans. And when we make plans, we tend to stick to them too much, not orienting toward sufficiently problems and risks and addressing them effectively. So that's called the planning fallacy. And that's a pretty big problem for any of these cognitive biases. When you're in the 5 to 10% range, that's fine. It's not a big deal. That's kind of regular to be expected, happens. When you're getting into the 15 to 20% range, that becomes kind of the more moderate problem. When you're answering kind of this is not a problem, that's kind of the 5 to 10% range. Moderate problem is the 15 to 20% range. When you're getting above 20%, that's a serious problem, because you want to address it when it's above 10%, but you really want to address it when it's above 20%, because it means that you're misallocating your resources. Your resources are going to one project, it's taking up too much time, you're not getting another project done, and that snowballs from there. That causes a lot of problems going forward. All right. Number 2. So think about this one. Of all the team conflicts that occurred, so we had team conflicts, Jarlath described some, other folks described some. Of all the team conflicts that occurred, what percentage of them occurred because someone on the team overestimated the effectiveness of their communication skills and persuasiveness? So when a team conflict occurs, what percentage occurred because someone overestimated how effective they are in communicating and persuading others? 10%, 15%, 5%? 20%. Let's get a couple of more people sharing 20%. So this one refers to the illusion of transparency. The illusion of transparency is about us feeling that we are effective communicators. It's intuitive to us to feel that we're effective communicators. We feel that we're fully transparent to others, that our message that we send is fully received by the person to whom we send it. That's an illusion, unfortunately. In this modern age of Zoom, virtual communication, there's often technical issues where people are dropping off you're on mute or something like that. There's technical issues, glitches. Of course, in-person communication is notoriously difficult as well, because you can mishear something, can have different interpretations of the same words, which happens very often. People don't realize that they mean the different things when they say them, when they say the same thing. And of course, someone can mishear, not be paying attention. They can be thinking about an important meeting that's coming up, or they can be thinking about what they're going to eat for dinner or something like that. And of course, they can be falling into confirmation bias and misinterpreting what you're meaning. They can be having blinkers when you're trying to signal to an important issue in the production department, quality, and over time, and the VP of operations is not realizing that this is something that they really should be taking care of as a strategic initiative. That's likely falling into a confirmation bias about their ability and their responsibility and accountability and their strategic place in the company. So for example, all of these sorts of things might be going on. All right, number 3. Out of all significant decisions that occurred in your company, in what percentage of cases was someone overconfident about the decision? So someone felt overconfident, they didn't gather enough information, they jumped to conclusions, they felt overconfident. Your assessment, again, doesn't have to be 100% right. This is your impression of how much someone was overconfident about their decision. So whether it's a decision to serve new clients in the DoD department, in the intelligence department, whether it's their impression of how to approach a new project or anything like that, whether to do this contract with a no compete clause. So we have 20%, 15%, 25%, 15%. So, and other folks, welcome you to share. This relates to the overconfidence bias. We already talked about the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect refers to the fact that when someone has a little bit of knowledge, they tend to be more overconfident than when someone has a lot of knowledge. And that's a separate subcomponent of a bigger tendency called the overconfidence bias, where we tend to be too confident about our decision-making and gather insufficient information, especially for those adaptive problems, for those complex problems, for those chaotic problems. It's often the case that we tend to see them, well, this is a very complex problem. I'm never going to be able to gather sufficient information, so let me throw up my hands and just go with what I feel. That is not the right answer. There are ways of mitigating risks, addressing risks, looking for analogies, and asking good questions about these sorts of problems that we'll go through next to address these tensions. All right, and there are, of course, 27 more questions like this. Then there's an assessment part where you assess, okay, what's the score that you got overall, and what is the impact on your organization financially from all of these cognitive biases, and then what are the next steps that you can do to address these. I'm not going to go through them right now, but you'll get the assessment and you can do this on your own. All right, great, we should be back. I will be happy to take any questions on the assessment at this point.
This is Amy. It feels very subjective.
Yep, it is.
How useful is a score given I feel very much like we're guessing and being subjective.
It's very important to see what you're perceiving the problem to be. So what I often see in leadership teams is that different people will give different scores. Now, somebody will give, for the overconfidence bias, they'll give 2%, and somebody will give 50%. And that's a very important difference because it gets at tensions and challenges and differences within your leadership team and their perceptions of what's going on. And the value comes in the discussion, seeing what are the perceptions of overconfidence, what's going on, why are there different perspectives, and getting that issue out there. Now, when you're overconfident about your decision, you're not going to be realizing you're overconfident about your decision. That's just how our brains work. So that's an example. When you're feeling that you're an effective communicator, you're not going to be realized that you're not as effective as you feel you are. So all of these sorts of things, and there's so many other things that apply. When you feel like you're making a great plan, you're not going to be understanding that your plan is actually not so great. So there are so many of these things that apply to trying to figure out what are the kinds of problems that the organization is facing, and then addressing them, and then minimizing them. and seeing what's the change over time. So you're going to get a baseline, take it first, get a baseline, and then see what changes over time as you take it again, and as you see the impact of your interventions on addressing these cognitive biases in the organization. Does that help, Amy? Not sure if Amy's still with us. Well, hopefully she'll come back. So I hope that.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Thumbs up.
Okay,
This
great.
is Jim. I have a question for you, Doctor.
Yes, please, Jim.
One of the things that I'm working with Pete on one-on-one a lot is a better asking questions in a different way. So earlier in the meeting, we had somebody, talk about the person always says no and how to ask that question, yes, but, which was, a fantastic idea. Sometimes I find in these discussions when I don't ever try to psychoanalyze anybody with my knowledge of cognitive bias or anything like that, but my head, it's this surreal conversation. My head has got 5 conversations while I'm listening to one person. And one thing that always jumps out at me in situations when you do try to challenge back to your workers is a level of defensiveness. How do you address defensiveness in these situations, whether they're an optimist or a pessimist, whether they have a specific bias? Sometimes that defensiveness can if you don't control it, it can become anger.
Oh yeah, defensiveness is really important to understand, and how to address that, you can use things like curiosity and empathy. So empathy is fundamentally important. Understanding where they're coming from emotionally and relating to them emotionally. It's not an easy skill to develop, but relating to them emotionally, saying, hey, I connect with you, I care about you, you are very important to me. Let's talk about this issue, and this issue is separate from you, separate from our relationship, separate from who we are to each other. This is an issue about behavior and how we can improve this going forward. So having that and having that perspective fundamentally, and having that person feel that trust, that connection, that empathy, that caring is incredibly important to address defensiveness. And that's one. The second is curiosity, making an assumption of generosity, that this was an honest mistake, this was not anything in any way malicious, which I presume you do anyway, but often defensiveness comes from a presumption, from a feeling that the other person sees you behaving in a certain way for a malicious reason, for a negative reason, for a harmful reason. And instead of saying, why did you do that stupid thing, to help me understand, help me understand your decision-making here. What happened in this situation? That's a curiosity question. And that asks about them, asking about them to share. It doesn't say, why did you do this stupid thing? It asks, can you walk me through the process of what's going on here? And then you can, through Socratic questioning, you can ask them questions about the aspect of the decision that you felt was not very helpful. But yes, the relationship of trust and that empathy is fundamentally important in the beginning. Does that help?
I would add 2 things, Jim, and happy to go a little deeper in our one-to-one. The first one is an attitude of curiosity. Just get much more curious before you make an internal decision about what you believe happened. And then the second one is assume positive intent. And if we come at it from that mindset, we show up energetically different in the conversation. So just 2 thoughts. Ben, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I have sort of just a quick question, which is I have tried, I have a tendency to be directorial instead of asking questions, always looking for better questions. I've noticed with my immediate leadership team, one of them in particular is got this technique for diverting my questions back to me, sort of like the statement of like, he or she who's asking the questions is in charge. I'll ask, help me understand your rationale for this decision. And then he'll respond by saying, well, help me understand the rationale for not doing it this way. And as stupid as this sounds, I literally am like a deer in headlights when he does this. I'll say, I'm curious, how do you came to this conclusion? It's like, well, I'm curious what you're,
Yes. So I understand what you're saying, and that's kind of just something you have to stop. That's clearly they've learned that that's something they can trick you into. So that's something you have to, that's a habit, and that's a habit that you need to stop. Really, this is something where you need to realize, okay, This is a defensive technique on their part. You say, oh, please, from now on, don't answer a question with a question. That is something that you just have to stop as a behavior. This is where you go meta, meaning go above the conversation, and you don't talk about the object level, what's actually happening, but you talk about how the conversation is going, saying, I don't think it's helpful when you answer a question with a question, so let's avoid doing that. Please help me, please go ahead and answer the original question I asked, and so that we can go forward and collaborate effectively together. How about that? So you call them out on their BS, essentially. Other questions? I hope that's helpful, Ben. You can follow up if you wish, but if anyone has other questions, I'll be happy to take them as well before going forward. All right, so talking about questions, I will get now into a technique that you can use to make daily decisions or moderately important decisions or huge decisions if you don't have too much time to go through a big process, through a more thorough process. This is a technique that you want to use not to make the perfect decision, not to make the best decision ever, but to make a good enough decision, which is sometimes fine for major decisions. When you want to, let's say, decide on whether to sign the contract with the clause of, without a no compete clause or no solicit clause. Sometimes that's a good enough decision. You don't need to make the perfect decision. You make the best choice among a number of very good options. It's kind of a binary. So this is these are 5 questions that you want to use to avoid decision disasters. They're also useful that you should be using them 5 to 10 times a day for those important decisions that you don't want to screw up, but you only take a couple of minutes for, 1 to 2 minutes to run through these 5 questions that you want to ask about those decisions that can result in a disaster that you don't want to result in a disaster. So, what important information didn't I yet fully consider? What evidence didn't you take into account? And remember, this is a question not about, you don't need all the information. The question asks about what is the important information that you didn't fully consider. And what's important is usually something that goes against your intuition. So look for aspects of the decision that go against your intuition. Try to disconfirm your initial impression. Try to go against your initial choice. And if you can't disconfirm your decision, that's great. But if you can, that's a very good time to stop and revise the process. And this, again, it's not going to take long. So let's say you're writing an important email to a client where you're trying to persuade the client to do something that's going to be kind of a hassle and stressful, or perhaps to some leader in your organization who you want to say, okay, you really need to take accountability for this situation or something like that, where they're not going to be wanting to do what you want them to do, but they really know that they should be doing that. And there's some emotional blockers that are inhibiting them from doing the right thing. So you can ignore the information that would cause them to not do the right thing. Or, and that's the important information that you didn't fully consider, and the email might not be very effective if you ignore that information because they'll still have that internal objection. Or you might include the information in the email addressing their objections that you anticipate them having, saying, okay, it's a hassle, it's a drag because of reason X, Y, and Z, but here's reasons A, B, and C, why I think it's still the best thing for you to do this, the best thing for you, the best thing for the organization, for this to happen. Next, what dangerous judgment errors haven't I yet fully considered? So what haven't you taken into account? And once you go through the assessment, once you learn about the dangerous judgment errors, which are described in the end of the assessment for each of the questions, that'll become habitual and that'll become an easy mental motion. So for example, if there's someone in the organization who is a pessimist with whom I, having an issue and I want them to do something, I will need to address my horns effects toward pessimists. I will need to inherently kind of a negative tendency to think of them, okay, they're really risk averse, they're not having the right thought pattern. And that's not my rational mind speaking, that's my older mind, that's the emotional part of me speaking. So I need to address that horns effect internally if I'm going to write an effective email, one that will speak to them in their language, and rather than orienting toward opportunities like I tend to do, orient toward addressing risks like they would like to see. And again, if it's your client, team member, whatever. What would a trusted and objective advisor suggest I do? So think about that little angel on your shoulder. What would they suggest you do in this situation? What would Pete suggest you do in that one-on-one? You don't have to have Pete right there in the one-on-one. You get about 50% of the benefit from this question just by asking it. So ask, what would Pete do? Or ask, what would one of your team members do? In the previous Vistage meeting, there was someone who was sharing that another Vistage member from their group came into their organization several times, gave them some good feedback, so that they were asking, what would Stephen do in this sort of situation? And that was helpful for them. So think about that kind of person who can be a trusted and objective advisor to you. Your Vistage chair, fellow Vistage members, maybe somebody else from your network who you can trust to be that objective advisor. And of course, you get 50% of the benefit, again, by thinking about what they would do, and you get the other 50% of the benefit by calling them if it's an important enough decision. How have I addressed all the ways this could fail? You want to assume that the letter fails. So go with that assumption that the person doesn't do what you want, even though they should. The client doesn't do what you want. The important stakeholder in your organization doesn't do what you want. Why did that fail? Maybe it failed because there was a COVID surge in their area, and their kids are now home from school where they previously were in school, and they're really distracted and pissed and upset that they can't go outside normally due to all the restrictions, which is happening to a number of my clients right now, California and elsewhere. So that's something that you need to realize might be happening. How can you look at that? Well, you can write the draft of the email, and then you can stop before sending it, and you can reread it as someone who is in a nasty mood and someone who's distracted because their kids are at home, and remove any aspects of the email that might be seen as hostile and guilty, pressuring, orient toward empathy, as we talked about, some curiosity if that's relevant to the situation, and attract the attention of the person to the most important parts of the email, perhaps by deleting some of the less important language and boldening the most important parts. Finally, what new information will cause me to revisit this decision? What would cause you to change your mind about this question? What would cause you to change your mind about the VP of operations? So when you're thinking about, okay, for me, like I said, if it's 3 months has gone on and she hasn't made a strategic initiative on this to address this operations issue, that's definitely raising a red flag for me about the capacity to handle the position. And definitely 9 months in, that's a huge red flag. So time might be one issue. So if more time passes and the person hasn't taken a decision, hasn't taken a step, that might be definitely an issue. Or with the email, it can also be time. It can be something like a revision point. Well, if my client doesn't answer to my email in a week, I'll give my client a call. That's a specific revision point, and then okay, that's something that I can very easily give when you have ruminating thoughts, when you have well, why is my client not answering? What's going on? You can easily put that off, and you could say, not worried about this. I know what I'll do. In a week, I'll give my client a call. This can also apply to having a collaborative project with someone. You can launch a small project before launching a major project. We talked about that in yesterday's Vistage meeting. So instead of just going with the waterfall approach of making a huge major project and going forward, you can do a small project, see how well you collaborate with that person, that company, that organization before entering into a full-fledged partnership. So that's another way of getting information that can cause you to revisit this decision. All right. Are there questions about these 5 questions before we go on to discussing them as part of a group? All right, doesn't seem that there are any questions. Let's see, somebody was in the chat. Okay, so Sri said that he'll need to jump off. Cool. All right, breakout rooms. So you'll see again the option to join the breakout room. We'll have another 8 minutes of discussion before going back in the same way. And then you'll see the clock ticking down for your last 60 seconds of discussion. David, Gary, let me know if you're having issues. I know Sri had to jump off for a second. So if you're having technical issues, let me know and we'll see if we can address the technical issues. And if you just need to take care of something, that's cool too.
If there's situations we want to address, I was kind of note taking when I was in that, and I don't have any specific like C story to tell you all about that.
I think the biggest challenge I seem to have, and I don't know what it is, but as I read through the questions, I sort of imagined myself in some sort of leadership meeting where we're talking through a decision or a change of direction. I just have a very difficult time formulating questions, like questions that would be related to these sort of on the fly. It's almost like I lack, like a new manager who's doing a review and like lacks the language for running an effective review. So an employee says, well, why'd you give me that raise? Or why'd you do this? And the manager's like, and so I guess and I see Dr. Gleb here, what I need to practice or read up on is sort of the, like if I'm obviously in my mind thinking, what important information have I not fully considered yet? And then using that to tease that out of the group. And that's where I might be met with, my president saying, sort of doing that. He's a seasoned sales guy. So he just like, why do you ask that? Why are you asking what the price is? But, it's like from sales, like put it back on the customer. And so I think I've got a document that I keep of just like lots of questions, and I try to kind of group them like probing questions, clarifying questions, but I still don't have them at the ready.
What I strongly encourage folks to do, and so Amy, I'll get back to that, but I want to make sure to answer Ben's question. When you're in part of a meeting, so when you're yourself, this is a decision-making process that's sufficient. You don't really need other questions. This is kind of looking at the research. These are enough to answer the vast majority of decision questions. So going through these questions, just going through them, that's going to be sufficient. It sounds like you have a lot of questions that are useful, but you don't have a process. Going through them that are standard. You need to have a clear checklist. This is a clear checklist. You use this checklist, these 5 questions to avoid decision disasters. I'll send you a decision aid for everyone who wants it that you can use, print out, and that's what you can use. And you need to standardize that throughout the organization. Then you need to get everyone on the team, on your leadership team, to say, okay, these are the 5 questions you will use to, and this is something I do all the time for my clients, I recommend to folks, I can tell you, get in more depth about how to do this. But basically getting your leaders and emerging leaders as well to ask these questions about their decisions. And then when you come to a team meeting, have everyone answer these 5 questions for themselves and have their answers written out, come to the team meeting with their answers at the ready. And then have everyone share the answers as part of a decision-making process in the meeting. So you just structure the agenda, the part of the meeting that's devoted to making a decision around these 5 questions. You go for the 5 questions. I can guarantee to you it's going to take much more, it's going to be much more quick than a typical decision-making meeting. My clients find they cut about 60% of the time from meandering conversations about issues that are kind of going nowhere, going down rabbit holes. If they just discuss these questions, go for the agenda, and they can feel confident about the quality of their decision as a result. So that's something that I would recommend. You don't want to be gathering too many questions. You want to have a clear checklist of questions. The more questions you have, the more confusing it is, and the more difficult it will be for you to know which ones to ask at the right time. So checklists are your friend in this case. And this is a clear
I used to be a leader in the Pentagon, and we went through these 5 questions all the time because there was always a political element, a money element, or a performance element. And so we made sure we covered all our bases before we went into any major meeting. Excellent. And then I went to PricewaterhouseCoopers as a consultant for a few years. And that experience led me well to be able to advise, again, larger companies or larger government people. And then I made a transition, a life decision. I said, I want to do something small but big. And that's why I came to this company. It's a small company and we're doing really big things. And these kind of questions, I'm having trouble in a small company talking through my employees at this level. Okay, there's a gulf between my experience and their experience. And I really carefully try not to come across as being, you know, the person with all the answers. So I really try to subordinate myself. I try to, you know, be subservient if I can, just to listen. And I have trouble bringing these top level of questions, which I think are perfect. And I can't say I did it exactly that checklist, but getting them to think that way. It just is a bigger challenge than I thought it would be. But also one that I truly enjoy because I care about these people, where I have to tell you in the Pentagon, I didn't always care about the people I was working with. Surprise, surprise. So that's where I'm having
Jim,
challenges with.
Jim, when you say, I guess you articulated maybe what I'm sort of experiencing. When you say you're having a difficult time, you know, asking these questions, that what's the specific difficulty? Is it the answers that, what's the specific?
Yeah, well, in a small company, you have clearly identified subject matter experts, people who say, you know, I'm the smartest person on the face of the earth in this one thing.
Yep.
Where you don't have that level of arrogance actually in a large corporation, because everybody knows there's somebody else just as smart as them out there. But they know in the small company, they probably are the smartest in that one area, probably smarter than me. And so they challenge my authority or my questioning. Not as severe as your president tells you. I think my Irish would get up after that. I think the response was, "Hey, this is not helpful," was a perfect answer on how to deal with that. But that's the challenge I have, is I have people who just challenge back, saying, because nobody knows this better than me, and I want like an outside opinion, or I want objective evidence, like, you know, I want that footnote to the paper that they're telling me, if you will, and that's my background, is root cause analysis. Everything had to be objectively proven. And so I come in saying, you know, we don't have the luxury of losing. In a big firm or in a big organization, you could take hits left and right. It doesn't really matter. I lived that dream. In this job, if we take a hit, we may never recover. And that's the thing that keeps me up. And so I don't know how to make, these are the right questions, but I have that employee who will just bounce back like, why do you have the gall, Jim, to even ask me this question? What do you think you are? You know? And,
yeah, I understand what you're saying. So you are, the thing is, what they don't get is that they're experts in content. They're not experts in decision making. That's not their expertise. And I think you need to help people realize that difference. That's a fundamental difference, and people don't understand that. And that's something that you need to create as part of the culture change. So strategic culture change, to say, okay, you're an expert in this narrow topic. That's wonderful. That's great. That's terrific. Great. You're not an expert in decision making. And here we're talking about the process of decision making. So let's talk about the process of how we make our decisions. And what you want to do is not try to convey your expertise, but establish a policy, a system, a checklist. These questions, again, I encourage using them because they're used, when you look at the evidence, they answer all the questions that are needed. You can create some of your own also to include them, but you want to have a checklist where everyone knows that before they come to you, they need to fill it out. They need to fill out a checklist, you know, with their, you know, paragraph answering each question. That is part of the decision-making process that we have in this company. That is the company way that we have. And then that will help you get to that level where, okay, they start asking these questions. And of course, you'll need to tweak things a little bit, but that is the process that I would strongly encourage. And that's the process that works really well for my clients. You want to differentiate between their subject matter expertise and their decision-making expertise, because that's not what they're an expert in. Amy, I saw you nodding. Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, so we have built into our senior leadership team, we have issue processing meetings, and we do them like once a month, and we don't have to define the topics in advance. Things come up in the business that we need to issue process, which is basically similar to this structure, but it's a structured process to process an issue and look at it, answer some of these questions. So that's one of the ways that we do it. I think another way is you can learn to think like this by doing the after action reviews, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Jim. And because you're kind of doing that after the fact, but you're still learning why you should have thought like that to begin with, and you can take those learnings forward. The other thing that so about 4 years ago, so we've had leadership retreats for about 4 years. And so the first year was complaining. The second year was complaining with some justification. And this year I actually got business cases. So I gave them a business case template. I said, you have to connect your solutions to the business objectives. So they had business objectives. And so it's been if you're wondering how long it takes, it took about 4 years.
Excellent. So we'll have a finishing up the discussion. Just want to close so that folks have time, but that's, I think, an excellent example. And what you want to be just commenting in the after action reviews, that tends to cause folks defensiveness. So if you're starting to institute this process, which I think Jim is starting to do, it's better to institute it at the front end, kind of asking the questions in advance about what can go wrong, all of these issues, and then later doing an after a post-mortem, essentially, because the post-mortem causes people to feel pretty defensive if they feel, and that's something that Jim was describing has sometimes an issue with his employees. So it's just a way to think about the emotional process and how people have that emotional journey as they approach decision-making, because their emotions are the main blocker to using effective decision-making processes.
Okay, see you.
All right, everyone. So what are your impressions based on the discussions of these questions, where they can be useful, how you can use them within your company?
So I thought about, obviously part of the premise here is to use these questions to avoid decision disasters. But how useful do you think this is also when you need to do a post-mortem on something that hasn't gone to plan?
Yeah.
To retrospectively apply these questions to the team as you look for learning opportunities in that post-mortem, and reinforce that if we thought of these one or all five of these questions, maybe we wouldn't have got into this situation.
Definitely. What I strongly encourage folks to do is to do these questions and then look at after a decision, both one that went well, do post-mortems of all decisions, major decisions, ones that went well and ones that went poorly. And then look at, okay, what kind of, how should we have structured these 5 questions better in the beginning for the poor decisions, for us to not make the poor decisions? And what did we do well on the good decisions that we want to learn from? Something that I see a lot of companies making a big mistake in is doing post-mortems only of failures. That's a big problem, because you don't learn what are the successful behaviors. You only learn about the problematic behaviors. And so you want to do post-mortems of all significant decisions, all significant projects. And that's something that you need to get into the habit of and see, okay, here's what we're doing well, here's what we're having problems with, and having that going forward. So just a thought. Other folks, and you can also ask questions, comments about these as well if you have any questions.
How have you, I'd be curious, how have you guys dealt with, again, it's sort of our naivete. I think my direct reports and our level 2 leaders, I think are probably overconfident in our ability to make sound decisions. So I think there's like a hubris in going through these, and I guess I'm trying to play out in my mind. I'm really just trying to nudge. My goal with all this kind of stuff is just to nudge us to become a little bit better, not to imply that we're but have any of you faced that sort of stuff? I mean, that Jim, that was the most helpful thing I think you shared in the breakout was Jim had shared that he's very familiar with these types of questions from working at the Pentagon and at PwC, but in a smaller company, there's a tendency for someone to say, as a supreme subject matter expert in a topic, when asked, sort of why you question is that their response, like, I'm the absolute expert in this. I know more about this than anyone at the company. So why are you busting my chops, type of thing. Those are my words, not Jim's. Anyone else experienced that sort of where your team is sort of resistant to too much probing? It adds time, and like what's prompted this from leadership?
Yeah, definitely. I think you work with highly educated, highly experienced people, but they all have egos at the end of the day, and they don't like their authority or their expertise questioned. I have a great CFO, but God, she hates it when she gets the question on stuff around what she perceives as competency issue for her. It's a funny lever for her button. One of her buttons is don't question my competency. But don't even if it feels like I don't intend to question her competency, but if she feels that that's where the question's going, there's a very hostile reaction to that very quickly. It's quite interesting.
So go ahead, Amy.
I was going to say, I believe that there's a cultural aspect to this, which you all are pointing to, which has to do with, having people be, Peter and I have talked about being deliberately developmental in a learning organization, because if you have that type of organization, then questions are sought as an opportunity to teach, and that we're always curious and there's always new things to learn, as opposed to a defending of your honor. And I don't know how you make that journey, per se, but I think that maybe that's at the root cause of it.
But Amy, you have a lot of PhD scientists in your group as well, and I find that group of people tend to be more sensitive, not always, but more sensitive to when they feel that a lay person is asking probing questions, and they feel very sensitive, very defensive around it. Do you not see that with your group?
No, they see it as like a scientific experiment that they want to pull apart all the pieces and learn about it and understand how it all works, and then put it back together in a way and we do experiments and pilots and stuff. And so they're really on board with that kind of thing, because we're not questioning them. It's this thing outside of them that we're all looking at and questioning it together. The common enemy, Ben, right?
So I think that's a really important point that Amy raises. And for people who are highly educated, analytical, and so on, there are a couple of ways of addressing this. And people who are arrogant, have a strong confidence. One is orienting toward how can we have done this better? Not how can you have done this better, or why did you screw up? But orienting toward how can we have done this better, and how can we do better going forward? That is a constant aspect of an organization cultural aspect. That's kind of a learning organization. And that's something that these academically inclined folks are going to tend to want to orient toward. They're in that peer review mode, kind of what are their peers thinking? How are they feeling about them, right? And they are strongly oriented toward others' egos. And when you could talk about how can we have done this better and how can we do this better going forward, that appeals to that competitive inclination toward that, okay, how can we think about this going better going forward? How can we do these types of projects going forward better? So that's kind of one way. And of course, another way is to integrate this into the review process. How good are you at taking feedback, and how good are you at learning? So that is a really important part of an effective leader, and that should be part of a review process for leadership assessment. All right. let's talk about a broader strategy that you use for strategic initiatives. So this is a technique, again, for, you can use this for daily decisions like those emails. You can use this for important decisions like that contract decision. So this technique, and of course, you can take it only a couple of minutes. If you, for an email, you can take a lot of time. For a contract or much more significant decision, this is a different technique that you use for any strategic initiative that you want to launch. That previous technique is not appropriate for a strategic initiative. That's a decision-making technique. This is for a strategic initiative that you want to launch. And this is a more thorough technique. It takes at least an hour for moderately important strategic initiatives, and of course, longer if you want to make a major strategic initiative. So choosing to go for that new direction in the intelligence agency that's opening up or not, choosing not to. Both of those are important decisions. So defending your future, you want to use this technique for those sorts of things. First, decide in the scope and the goals. So what is the area that you're assessing? You can make this for a whole strategic plan for your company. So that leadership retreat Amy was mentioning during the breakout session, for a strategic retreat, that's going to be a broad area. Or you can make it for a narrow area, like, do we go for this new orientation in the intelligence community or not? Or how do we approach our hiring, since that's an issue? Or how do we do the cultural tensions that are between the Americans and the French? And that can be a strategic area. And the scope, of course. So the area and the scope. What is the scope of the project? What are you taking on? And then the strategic goals. What is your vision? What do you want to be different about the company, around your team, after you go through this process? That's a really important aspect. If you want to integrate a learning culture, you want to have a vision of how the company will be different from how it is right now to how it will be after this initiative. And that's definitely a strategic initiative, a culture change, if you want to make your company have much more of a learning culture. Then the timeline. So 6 to 60 months. I really recommend not going beyond the 60 months. Don't do a 10-year plan. That we really have difficulty predicting what's going on after the 5-year timeline. And we have the most effectiveness within the 6-month timeline. Then longer timeline, if you go toward the 60-month timeline, you know you're going to have less accuracy. So you'll need more resources to address uncertainty. Then gather your stakeholders. I strongly recommend no more than 4 to 6 people, no more than 10 people. I was having a strategic retreat to pivot a company, 500 people company. It's a $1.4 billion in September for COVID. So strategic pivot for COVID. And their leadership team was 6 people, but they wanted to include not simply their leadership team, but their next level team, which would be about 25 more people. 30 people in the room, not good, not good. So eventually negotiate to have 8 people in the room. So leadership team and 2 more people. You don't want more than 10 people. You want a balance of expertise and authority. Expertise and authority. You have a strategic plan, that's broad, mostly about authority. If you're deciding to go into this new direction with the intelligence agency or not, you want to have people with some expertise on this decision, even though they might not have too much authority in the company. You consider recruiting an independent facilitator. So Pete might be a great person to recruit, or someone from the Vistage group or somebody else. So obviously, so whatever you want to do, whoever serves as a good independent facilitator for you. Next. What's your anticipated future? What if the future goes as you anticipate without any major changes? Everything goes according to plan. How many resources would you require? So let's say the new direction, the intelligence agency goes great, everything's fine. How many resources would you require for that situation? Then unanticipated problems. So what can be the kind of problems that you don't anticipate coming up? Write these out anonymously, write them out anonymously. I had a situation, not with a strategic pivot for this company, but with a product launch assessment where somebody wrote that this product launch will fail because the VP of operations hates the guts of the VP of sales. And that's not something that would have been said in the room very openly. That's a political issue. So you want something that where you have an opportunity to write out problems anonymously. That's why independent facilitator like Pete, another Vistage member, someone like that is very helpful. Estimate the likelihood and the impact of each problem, and then determine the most serious ones. So what's the likelihood of each problem occurring? What is the impact of each occurring? So let's say if you're having, the driving is the biggest risk for you. What is the likelihood of accidents occurring? What is the impact of each accident? What would be the cost of addressing these issues? And then brainstorm solutions. So with more defensive driving, there are many things that you can do to address that. Identify what kind of resources you need to solve these problems and update your strategic plan with this new information, including these resources that you would need to solve these problems. Then unanticipated opportunities. It's not only the problems, there can be opportunities that come up. You want to write them out anonymously as well and estimate the likelihood and the impact of each. So for example, the company that was doing the strategic pivot in September, they are a sales engagement software company. And so what they decided to do as part of their opportunity was to create for their customers who they help with their sales, to create a pivot package for them to help their customers pivot as part of COVID and in general pivot as a package, so an upsell. And that turned out to be an opportunity that they decided to pursue. That was a very promising one, and brainstorm ideas on how to bring them about and seize them, identify the resources needed. So they took some resources from their existing product development to develop this, and they update the strategic plan with this new information. And from what I'm learning about their launch of this new strategic pivot, offering for their customers, it's really quite successful. Then look at the dangerous judgment errors. So we talked about the dangerous judgment errors using the assessment, so you learn about them. If there's no opportunity to use the assessment for some reason, check for some of the most common ones. Loss aversion is a big one. We tend to avoid losses more than we want gains. Dollar lost and dollar gained gives us the same bottom line, but we're much more averse to losing a dollar than to gaining a dollar. It's irrational, but that's how it is. Status quo bias. We tend to be oriented toward where we are right now and not be willing to launch changes because of anxiety, uncertainty, not wanting to change our existing plans. That's the status quo bias. Talked about the confirmation bias. Attentional bias. We tend to pay attention to what's most emotionally salient, what draws us the most in our environment, regardless of whether that's the most important thing or not. Then overconfidence. We talked about the overconfidence bias. That's a big one. Optimism bias, pessimism bias, halo effect, horns effect. So we talked about these. Next, unknown unknowns. Think about unknown unknowns. So Jim was talking about him being in the Pentagon. I'm sure he knows Donald Rumsfeld's idea of these unknown unknowns. It's the unknown unknowns that will get you, not the known unknowns, also called black swans. And scan your environment for these major disruptors. So the pandemic, of course, COVID-19, huge disruptor. And most businesses, the large majority of them, were not prepared for the pandemic. If you look at the vast majority of businesses, what they use to protect themselves from disruptors is business continuity insurance. Well, business continuity insurance is essentially property casualty insurance. It only works if your property suffers damage, not for something like the pandemic. So they're not prepared, they weren't prepared for the pandemic, and they didn't get insurance payouts. There were a number of businesses that chose to get a pandemic rider on their insurance, and they are making out quite fine in the pandemic because they're protected and their insurance is paying them out due to the interruption in their business. So that's something that you can look at and evaluate, okay, what is insurance offering? What are these riders that they're offering and not? What are important thought leaders like Bill Gates saying? He was predicting a pandemic for quite a while. So you can scan your environment and you can take steps to address them. And this doesn't only apply to you, that this applies to your key stakeholders. So if you're providing, let's say, government services for the intelligence agency or other sorts of services for their companies, what might be impacting them? What might be causing them to have changes, disruptors? What can impact them that can impact your business? And decide on the resources you'll need to address these. So for example, of course, with the pandemic insurance, if you decide, okay, we should buy that rider, the pandemic rider for our insurance, that's the way to address that. But you can't account for all events. You don't have riders for all events. Solar flare that takes out our communication for 2 weeks. That's not something that insurance companies offer a rider for. So you need to have a cash cushion in reserve. About 40%, what the research on this topic shows, it should be about 40% of what you use for other unknown unknowns. So when you identify, here are the kind of unknown unknowns, major disruptors, after you go through that process, you add 40% and keep that in the bank of whatever you identify. So if you have, let's say, you identify, you need 200,000 for all of these other riders for your strategic plan for the next 5 years. So that's what you need. Then you want to reserve 80 more thousand just for your bank to have a cash cushion. and consider how to make your plans more resilient and flexible. There's definitely ways of doing that, and that will help you address unknown unknowns. And finally, communicate and take the next steps. Communicate effectively about the results of this exercise to all stakeholders, reserve the resources you need, and take the next steps. All right. Now, let's go into the breakout rooms. So I'll give you about 5 minutes to discuss this and see what are your thoughts about this. And then we'll get back to a broad discussion. So a little bit shorter than the previous one, 5 minutes.
The guitars and yeah, being very hard to understanding.
We definitely don't have the egos you're talking about, but I have seen them because, you know, I do work with NIH.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not naive to what you're describing.
No, it's funny. Well, it's not funny, but it's it's a challenge. So dealing with these egos.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for
So,
sure.
let's talk about these techniques. So what are your thoughts?
I've been sort of preoccupied with, you know, sort of this idea that I need to have a one-to-one with Mike, our president, after this, and just get on the same page with. I think what I've sort of been noticing is it's a combination of the, you know, he's very confident in himself, and I think he has right to be. I mean, we've done very well since March under his, or April since his, you know, him assuming that, but. Sort of getting on the same page with, you know, getting ahead in this regard and sort of working this into our process. And I anticipate sort of like a, you know, we're kicking ass and taking names. Why are you assigning work to me? You know, because I'm doing work, and you know, and so just getting on the same page with. About that, and I think that's been my larger challenge with our new organizational structure is, you know, I only am really managing 2 people, but they are considerably more challenging to, they don't require a lot of management, but then when I go to dig into something or question something, the way they respond is a lot different. So I just need to nip it in the bud.
It's a wise idea. And I think one of the things that I'm hearing you say, so there are both 2 things that I'm hearing you say. One is an object level challenge and one is a meta challenge. The object level challenge is how to institute these methodologies into your organization. Because everything is going well, and so people, you know, president will say, Mike will say, we're doing great. Why are you bothering me? I think that's a very fundamentally flawed and not strategic way of thinking, because the time to improve your organization is always when things are going well. You can't improve it when things are, you know, when you're in a crisis. In a crisis is the time to deal with a crisis. What you want to do when things are going well is anticipate fires and put the fires out in advance. It takes so many less resources to put out a fire in advance than to put out a fire. It's like Ben Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That's a culture that's very important to integrate into the organization, especially the leadership team. Each of your leaders, Ben, needs to be thinking that way. When things are going well, when there isn't a fire I'm currently putting out, I need to be working on anticipating and addressing future fires, which includes making sure that I take advantage of opportunities as well as prevent problems. So that needs to be a fundamental aspect of the organization's culture, that what am I doing right now? Prevent fires, seize opportunities, address problems, you know, anticipated problems and seize opportunities. So that's if your people, especially the top people, aren't thinking that way, I think that's definitely a culture issue that I would strongly encourage you to work on. And there's a different issue on kind of the personal relationship with these folks and them feeling too empowered and not willing to work with you and collaborate with you. And I think this approach, this kind of changing culture to address threats in advance, which you're clearly doing, right? But you seem like you're the only one in the organization who is thinking that way. Or maybe there are others, but you seem to be kind of in this position, especially if the people at the top aren't. I think this will also help take care of the relationship issue with people not being willing to be questioned, because it comes from complacency. They feel everything is going well. They're not future oriented, and they're not taking care of the problems before they're happening.
I was going to say the same thing, is like, no better time than the present to say that we're going to be an organization that questions everything, because we can't predict the future. I mean, here we are in this future that no one could predict. And let's be future focused and challenge our assumptions and constantly be vigilant about thinking about these things and just build it into who we are as an organization.
Yep. And that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure could be a fundamental aspect of culture kind of motto. That is a really good way of thinking going forward. And that's a way that people understand, you know?
Yes.
I mean, the way you describe this, Dr. Gleb, I mean, when I think about the strategic planning process, I mean, I've done, since I've been with my organization for just over 2 years now, I've had to present the several iterations of the 5-year plan to the board of directors. And the company's gone through a fairly large strategic change over the last 2 years. And so that strategic planning process has been very much a constant scenario that I've been working with. And the way you describe this, it resonates very strongly around, well, a lot of this is strategic planning that you're describing here. And when I break down the strategic planning process I've been going through over the last 2 years, it does talk to a lot of this. So I think it's just good reinforcement. And certainly what I struggle with, though, actually, one thing you talked on, two things you talked on, which was interesting to me, you're getting the stakeholders together. You have your leadership team, and you have the extended leadership team. And I have a dynamic right now in my organization where a lot of the extended leadership team are clamoring to be on the leadership team. So the way I look at it, I have a global leadership team, which takes the general managers from my French organizations, the GM from my US organization, global head of sales, CFO. That's really the most senior level of business. But then on each site, I have obviously another level of management now, constantly clamoring to be on this so-called global leadership team. And you don't want to necessarily demoralize people by saying no. So you try and bring them in for maybe special projects. You maybe invite them in to present. They may be sitting on that leadership team for a particular project, but it's getting that balance between motivating and not diluting all the decision making.
What is quite helpful in that sort of situation, you might be already doing this, so tell me if you are, is to have strategic planning for those units as part of a broader strategy. So here's the broader strategy for the company. How will your department define or orient toward not simply implementing the strategy, but developing its own strategy within this broader plan, and have them go through the exact same process. Okay, here's the broader company strategy. How will we fit into it? How will our department develop our strategy in the context of this broader company strategy? This process, that's Defend Your Future, goes for this very well. It addresses the same thing. It's kind of, here are the scope and goals, because the scope and goals need to fit within that. But there's many ways that each business unit can accomplish the broader strategy of the company. So you want that local leadership unit to also go through its own strategic planning process.
Thank you.
You are welcome. So finish up the discussion. We'll be closing up in 60 seconds, but you're welcome to finish up the discussion, address other things that you want to address. So Jareth, I hope that's been helpful. That answer is helpful.
Thank you.
And then, of course, you can see who in those teams performs best in those local leadership processes as a way of grooming the next generation of leaders. Because, there are some people who think they should be on the leadership team who really shouldn't be on the leadership team.
No, for sure. For sure. Okay.
Waiting for, I think, one more person. Okay, everyone's here. Great. So what are your insights and questions that you have about this process from the discussions and just your pondering of it?
One person in our breakout was lamenting the fact that they didn't have the caliber of people that should be, that are, he would like to have this conversation with. So that just points out something to pay attention to.
That's important to realize, that sometimes some folks are not going to be a good fit for a leadership role. You can, however, get them involved in various aspects of the process. And I'm telling you that they can address things. And I've heard this before. What they can do is they contribute to the unanticipated problems and unanticipated opportunities section really well. Because when they're experts in an area, that's something that they can contribute, and they can be surprisingly helpful. So it's kind of people with expertise. And of course, you want people with authority as well to make those decisions. So that would be something to look at. Also, that's a way of developing people, including them in the process. So if you have a certain leadership team and then you're getting a couple of other people, you're developing their higher level thinking about this as they go through the process. So they learn this process thinking, and that I would recommend, and that's been quite helpful for a lot of folks who I know, for a lot of clients.
Gleb, this is Jim Shannon. The other thing that I mentioned is when you, I fully agree with trying to keep it in a controllable situation for your strategic decision making, but somebody eventually, always somebody feels disenfranchised. Even if you go, I'm going with 6 + 2 or 8 + 2, there's always one more who believes they should be in that position. And I've tried to reach out to those kind of people. In one case, the person just left the company. He had a very narrow level of subject matter expertise, but he was the expert in one thing. And it actually has hurt us a little bit. So because he left with all the information and nobody knows how to do what he did. So that one extra person who's disfranchised, how do you address that?
It's a difficult issue, and I think you want to have a process for selecting people. So the way that you address that is to make sure that there's a clear and transparent selection of people for the gathering stakeholders. The crucial thing is that people feel it's fair and that there's a process where their concerns are heard. If they feel that it's just subjective, just Jim kind of, just snapping his fingers and deciding you're in or out, that will be a negative. They'll feel the attention, they'll feel not cared for, they'll feel disrespected. But if there's a process where you go for, okay, here are the standards that we use for who's going to be included, for who's not going to be included in this meeting, and maybe the standards for next one, not shifting the standards, will mean that you will be included because your expertise is more relevant or something like that. You will have a process that will help people decide, feel enfranchised, feel that it's fair. It's all about fairness when you go for the decision-making process and how people respond to it. If their concerns are heard out and if they feel that the process is fair, they will generally accept the conclusion, even if they don't like it. Anyone else? Other comments about strategic initiative, strategic planning? Any questions about this? All right, looks like there are no questions. So I mentioned that you'll all get additional resources if you wish. So look, additional resources. So free coaching session with me, just in taking this much more in depth, discussing how to integrate this into your organization. That might apply to things like Jim was saying, how to make sure that your folks who are subject matter experts can have more of a process thinking. How do you raise their development and raise their ability to think this way? to things that Jarlov was saying was about how to navigate this kind of elite arrogance of these academics, or what Ben was saying, how to make your culture a more learning organization, specific issues around your organization, or more broadly, how to integrate these techniques, whatever might be helpful for you. Then the assessment and dangerous judgment errors in the workplace, this decision aid on 5 questions to avoid decision disasters, which you can print out, use, and forward to your team, have them use, and use for your decision making for everyone as part of a team meeting, which we talked about. The manual on Defend Your Future, so how you use this technique. And finally, the free books, the digital versions of the 2 books that Pete mentioned. My best-selling book, the one I'm best known for, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, and my newest book, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, talks about COVID-19 and the post-pandemic recovery. So if you look at the poll, we'll use polling again. So please answer whether you would like to get post-presentation resources or not. So go ahead, vote. And as you vote, I will be happy to take your questions. I think there's one person who hasn't voted yet, so make sure to finish up voting.
I have a question.
Sure, looks like everyone wants resources, so I'll just send it to everyone. Okay, so look for an email from me soon with the resources. Okay, yes, please go ahead, Amy.
So, one of the things that I'm finding challenging in today's current environment is using evidence-based decision-making because there is no evidence, or there's no way to, it feels like there's no way to really know what the future will hold. There's little predictability. So, wanting to make the right decisions, wanting to kind of run some of these things into the ground and make sure we're thinking about this strategically, but still feeling like you're guessing.
So what you want to do in each case is not fall into a cognitive bias called information bias, which causes you to look for too much information to make the decision. You want to decide how much information you need to actually make the decision and how much information is available. And you don't want to spend more time than is needed or more energy or than is available, running information into the ground that is available. You want to decide what is the important information, and that's part of the 5-step decision-making process. So let me make sure to go back to that one. Okay, so that's the first question of this step. What important information didn't I yet fully consider? That means you have to decide what's important. It doesn't mean, just looking for all the information out there. So you want to think about what's important and what's available as part of what's important. And then, if it's not important or not available, don't use that. Use information, use things that will offset your risks. So what will cause you to change your mind? How have you addressed all the ways this could fail? These are risk offsets that you can control. There's information about the future that we can't control, and that's fine. But we can control steps we take ourselves to make the situation less risky. So for example, probably a huge risk for, let's say Jim would be him having, getting sick with COVID and being out for 3 months. That would probably be pretty bad for his company, given that so there needs to be a succession plan kind of for temporary disability or something like that. Or things like this. There are things that you can control that even if you don't know the future.
And we're heading more and more into that environment, folks, of unknown. And so I like the phrase out of Lean Startup, fail fast, but fail forward. And maybe it's smaller decisions that get you closer to the bigger topic that you can experiment with a little bit that mitigates the risk.
Yeah, and that's a great aspect of question 5. What new information will cause you to revisit this decision? So that's where you can launch a small experiment and see, okay, what's the result of this experiment, and then go forward and kind of set points, the revision points throughout the process. So we don't want to use a waterfall approach when you can use a lean approach. So the waterfall refers to making everything in advance and launching it, versus lean kind of iterating and trying things out. Thank you, Pete. Other folks, other questions?
Why don't you exit your screen and go to gallery so we can wrap up?
I believe I did. Yep, I believe I had to remove the spotlight. Yep,
Okay,
yep, should be a gallery.
got it.
Mhm.
What other questions for Dr. Gleb? And if not, let's do a round of takeaways. I'll start with you, Jim Shannon. What stood out from today's presentation that was particularly helpful for you?
I've had the opportunity to learn about biases in the past from different speakers and opportunities I have had in my career, but this one was refreshing because I liked the way that Gleb was able to contrast the work he has studied and written books about to what maybe some other people have said, not criticizing the other views, just kind of putting it in a better place. The whole comparing the older Savannah world to the modern world is something I really haven't discussed. And I like studied, and I like the way he said it. It's easier for me to be able to explain those differences because I've been around a lot of people who say trust your gut, and my military experience is not to trust your gut, that you should always have pre-planned responses. So you have to think through all those potential risks and then study them, memorize them, get your muscle memory in place. So when, all of a sudden you find yourself in the middle of a minefield, that once happened to me, you just know how to react and you don't think your way through it. If you trust your gut, you're going to drive right over a mine. So I'm not a believer in gut instinct because usually my experience is people always make the wrong decision. And then in the business world, I've not learned how to apply that because I've still only been in the business world for 4 years. I'm still learning the way people think in this side of the sector. And so I had a little jump up in my knowledge level today. So I appreciate that, Gleb. And I'll be able to apply some of those things we learned.
Very good. Thank you. Sri, how about you?
So one of the things that, like Jim, I've heard these things, these principles, many of them before in different contexts. I find them compelling. I use them in my own approach and leadership style, sometimes maybe a lot more so than I should. So interestingly enough for me, I probably, and Pete and I have talked about this, maybe I overanalyze things a little bit more than I need to and struggle with that. But what I've lost sight of a little bit in trying to figure out myself is that these biases impact others, and trying to understand where those biases are influencing others' behaviors. I think, and what their other motivations are being impacted through those biases, I think is important for me.
That's an interesting insight, and look forward to exploring that with you, Sri.
Excellent.
Very good. Ken, how about you?
I think I'll kind of echo one part that you mentioned in our breakout. That I do like the concept of the questions and the types of questions asked and how they're being asked. I will say also that part of it, one of my struggle was going through it is like, as Amy mentioned, like the subjectivity of it. And I realized that maybe I have my own biases there as I'm kind of judging, if you will, my team. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'm biased because I feel like I'm the smartest one in the company at the moment. I don't really like that. So I have to go back and do another assessment of myself also about this. And even when I looked at the assessment for the next steps, I was thinking like, okay, well, when should I do this or how should I do it? Because when I looked over it before, my thinking was one way, but what if I came off vacation with something else? So it's like that timing of it. So, it's still my subjectivity, and I have to like do an assessment myself, like, hey, when is the best time to do this? And when should I actually take the time to actually map this out and have this plan?
The best way to approach this is to take it and then look at your results over time. Take it again, see what changed, and evaluate why it changed. So you want to have that understanding. It's not, there's likely some reason in your thinking that your thinking changed between the vacation and after the vacation. And you want to explore, again, the assessment is not, this is not the bottom line of your company. This is not like you're making, you're losing 5% or winning 5 or gaining 5%. That's not what it's about. It's about you realizing, making certain insights about your company, and that your thinking changed over time that likely indicates that there's some more insights that you gained over time. So that's what I would advise with that.
Or maybe I'm just bad crap crazy myself, right? I mean, I don't know. So
But that's fine. I mean, that's one of the reasons you discuss it with others, and you have others in your company take it as well.
okay.
We all got a little crazy going on, Ken. That's why you ask the questions. Gary, your takeaway.
So unfortunately, I missed the whole second half, over involved in a crisis. But it's actually funny because what I got called into, I got to see firsthand some of this optimism part that we were talking about. I just real briefly, I've been brought in last minute to help 3 other companies throw together a proposal for a ginormous contract vehicle. They're all running around with their heads cut off. But they're all driving this optimistic streak, this overconfidence streak that they're going to be able to pull this off in a week. And I am in the unusual position of being the pessimist of the group because I have to dedicate resources to help them dig out of this hole. So anyways, it was just really kind of right timing. But one thing I'm going to do is when the video comes back out, I'm going to go back and watch everything that I missed because I'm really way behind the rest of the group. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Very good. Ben, how about you?
I wrote down four things. One is a reminder to myself that I think I've tended to sort of give myself a pass when dealing with really what I would consider to be complex and chaotic situations, probably being over reliant on gut. And I made a note, you don't need all the information, and that, using some of these frameworks, no matter how complex or chaotic the situation, is a good thing. So kind of never use your gut, for lack of a different term. That's number one. Number two is to use the key questions that the Dr. Gleb outlined to sort of nudge our team in the right direction to being a little bit better. There's an appreciation that when times are good, this came out in one of the breakout sessions, I get pushback from my direct reports that, hey, we've been kicking butt and taking names. Why are you monkeying around with stuff? Why are you questioning stuff? And the thing that was reinforced was, it's when times are good is when you work to improve, not when there's a crisis. And then finally, I had my direct reports complete the questionnaire independently. And I had them send those to me, and they're, all 3 of us are quite a bit different. So I thought a good exercise for us, which Dr. Gleb talked about earlier, would be to just have a discussion and talk through. I know one of my direct reports just interpreted, like she put 0, that no team conflicts are caused by people overestimating the effectiveness of their communication skills. And I brought up one example that I thought was an example, and she said, I didn't even think about that as a communication issue. I thought about that as like a weak, leader. And it was like, yeah, because they think that, they're super clear and no one knows what in the world they're talking about. So it'd just be a good debate. And the key for me will be to be a good facilitator and not start arguing with them.
Listen to your own wisdom there, Ben. Listen and learn.
I'm a slow learner.
Jarlath.
Well, the key takeaway for me was that having a British colonial accent meant that I was immune from the halo and haunted. So there you go. I'll just stop there. No, joking aside, I think, thank you, Dr. Gleb. It's been very, very informational. The confirmation bias thing for me was something that stood out quite a lot because, I'm surrounded by a lot of smart people. I work in a biotech company. I am the quintessential jack of all trades and masters of none. And I'm surrounded by a lot of people who consider themselves masters of their own particular domain. And it is very easy to take their word for it. It's very easy to let them, guide you in the decision making. And I think, I don't think I let that run riot. I don't let that get out of hand. But I think being able to ask these questions, 5 questions, and then maybe others, to temper that sort of subject matter expert influence in the business is important. And so that's something that stood out for me quite strongly over the course of the morning.
Great.
And I think one of the things that we talked about in the break, and something some folks might not have heard, is kind of differentiating between subject matter expertise and process expertise. Subject matter expertise, they have content expertise. You, as the leader, want to be the process expert, the decision-making expert. They're not experts in how to make decisions. They're experts in their content matter. But you want to be the expert in how to make decisions, in the process of how to make decisions, collaborate going forward. And that's where you need to see yourself and have other people see you as the expert.
Nice. Amy, your takeaway.
Dunning-Kruger Effect is now a new term that I know, and I think I will share that with my team. They will think it's hilarious. And I also thought it was interesting because I think, especially with Jarlath and I talking about different organizations, that, you know, I had a bias that certain types of people result in certain types of behaviors. Like by default, scientists are a certain way, or by default, women are a certain way, or, you know, those kind of biases. And so that kind of, you know, having the conversation that we have, very similar kind of maybe profile of education and experience, but very different, you know, the way they come to the job is very different. So that is a bias unto itself. So that was my other key thing I learned.
Thank you. Jay, hopefully you got bandwidth.
Hopefully, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's taking the time to methodically think through the questions and not just, you know, jump to a decision, and to really internalize them going forward as part of the decision-making process.
That's a key takeaway. One of almost a universal I find when I work with new CEOs is they value speed over effectiveness. And that's what you're getting to, Jay, is if you slow down and ask the questions, you're moving more towards effectiveness, which is the right way to go. David Billingsley, are you on the call? He's probably on a conference call. He's spinning a lot of plates, Dr. Gleb. All right. I'm going to let Dr. Gleb drop off. Thanks so much for your time today. Keep the call going so I can run the rest of the meeting. All right.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. And I'll send you all the resources. It's, I think, 100% voted for it. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.